afternoon, everybody. This is the Secretary of State Special Committee on Voter Confidence, and this is our final public meeting here in Keene.
I'm Ken Eyring from Windham.
Andrew Georgevits from Concord.
Dick Swett from Bow.
Pike from Manchester.
Merrill from Durham.
Olivia, Zink, Franklin.
So, welcome everybody. There is a sign-up sheet on the table over there. People want to participate in our public comment session, which will follow the presentations of our invited guests. The first order of business is approval of the minutes of the last meeting, which have been distributed. Someone will make a motion.
So moved.
Been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? If not, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Today we have invited several experts on election confidence and election matters, and because Senator Merrill played such an active part in suggesting and inviting them, I've asked her to.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if our three presenters could come forward to a cozy table. We're very pleased to have three eminent scholars with us today. That's even a better start than the first one I tried. I really appreciate your taking time to do this, and I'm glad it worked to wrangle you all together at the same time. I'm going to just say a little bit about all three. I'm going to read it so I get it right. And then I'll turn it over to the three of them. And they seem to be comfortable with your asking questions in between their comments. And apparently you all know each other. I mean, you three. So you may jump in on each other. I don't know. So first of all, Michael Herron is the Remsen 1943 professor of quantitative social science at Dartmouth. Professor Herron is an expert in election administration. That's a different committee, election administration and statistical methods, and has written extensively on issues such as voting by mail. He has written and testified in court on the topic of the calculus of voting, which explains voter turnout decisions with perceptions of costs and benefits, and on other issues related to election administration, among them voting lines and the correlates of rejected absentee ballots. Second, we have Charles Stewart, who is the, and I apologize if I have his name wrong.
Give it a try.
Kenneth, distinguished professor of political science at MIT. Professor Stewart has a broad range of expertise, including on political polarization and election administration. He recently provided analysis for the Washington Post surrounding the push to eliminate voting machines. Since 2001, Professor Stewart has been a member of the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project, a leading research effort that applies scientific analysis to questions about election technology, election administration, and election reform. He is currently the MIT director of the project. Professor Stewart is an established leader in the analysis of the performance of election systems and the quantitative assessment of election performance. Working with the Pew Charitable Trust, he helped with the development of Pew's Elections Performance Index. Professor Stewart also provided advice to the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. And finally, Professor Brendan Nyan of Dartmouth is the James O. Friedman Presidential Professor, Department of Government. Professor Nyan is an expert on misinformation, particularly as it applies to politics. He is the author of numerous academic papers, including the effects of unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud on confidence in elections. He also authored articles on topics such as the impact of fake news. He teaches an undergraduate course at Dartmouth called Political Misinformation and Conspiracy Theories. So we will go first to Professor Michael Herring.
Thank you very much. Distinguished members of this committee, I'm pleased to be able to speak with you today, as well as speak with my distinguished colleagues to my left and right. As Ms. Merrill mentioned, I'm a professor at Dartmouth College. I've taught there for 19 years, and most of my research these days is on election administration. I started studying election administration in 2000. Some of you may remember that was when there was a disputed presidential election, and much of the social science on the subject of election administration got its start around 2000 and thereafter. I feel that my entrance in this area is the same. When I use the term election administration, what I'm talking about is research on the conduct or mechanics of elections. So when people study elections, they typically look at two different sort of ways to think about them. One is how elections operate, and another is who wins elections. And I just want to emphasize that the study of election administration is really about the conduct. And so my own research focuses on, as Ms. Merrill mentioned, things like waiting in voting lines and ballot formats, not about whether Democrats or Republicans win. Obviously, everyone knows elections are ultimately contests and the mechanisms by which voters choose their officials, but my research really focuses on the mechanics of elections. All right, so I'm going to speak today briefly about concerns about voter fraud, and I'll just use the term election malfeasance. When I use the word fraud throughout my presentation here, I just want to be clear. I'm using this in a general or academic sense. This term the term fraud is tossed around in the public sphere many times. Of course, ultimately what is fraudulent is a legal question. I'm not offering any legal comments here. I'm simply describing concerns about malfeasance. I'll use the word fraud because that's the word that's often used in common discourse. But I just want to be clear. I'm using it in that way, not in a legal term. The reason I'm going to talk about fraud, or allegations thereof, is because ultimately this committee, I believe your charge is to study voter confidence and to understand what it is that will increase New Hampshire citizens' confidence in their elections and maintain it, and allegations of malfeasance obviously work against that. So that's my motivation for why we'll talk about fraud in particular. In the political science literature on election administration, there's a fair amount of research on methods used to study allegations of voter fraud. Much of this, there have been several different phases. Much of this literature dates to debates around voter identification laws in the United States. Those are often accompanied by allegations of voter fraud. There was an uptick, say in 2016, in claims about election malfeasance, and then starting in 2020 and beyond, there's been, I don't think the word uptick adequately captures the increase in allegations, but I'll just say a large increase in the sort of claims made about election malfeasance that speak directly to the notion of whether elections have integrity or not. The percentage of Americans who are confident in their elections, this number varies depending on polls and the way the question is asked, and it's a partisan component. I'll defer to Professor Nyhan talking about some of the more recent poll data, but I think it's roughly the figure of 35% of Americans seem concerned about whether there is fraud or malfeasance in elections. I wouldn't state too much exactly on the number 35, but that seems like a rough summary of recent research on this. When I talk about election fraud, there are really two types of claims. And I think this distinction is important from your perspective, which is why I will spend the rest of my talk sort of divided in this two notions. So the categorizations of fraud are as follows. There are narrow, or what you might call tailored allegations, and there are systematic allegations. And I think this categorization is important. And I will illustrate these two types of allegations with examples. So what I'm calling a narrow fraud claim is one that focuses on a specific jurisdiction and it has a specific idea of what exactly the claim about malfeasance is. So, for example, and Ms. Merrill mentioned this, there was an allegation in 2016 that Massachusetts voters participated in New Hampshire elections. Excuse me, Massachusetts residents participated in New Hampshire elections. I would call this a narrow claim because it was directed at a particular group of people, and their behavior, the alleged behavior was explicit. So I wrote a paper with some colleagues at Dartmouth on this. There's no evidence that Massachusetts residents participated in the 2000 general election as was alleged. But this is a good example of something that is narrow. Another example of a narrow claim, and this was made in 2020, there were claims in Pennsylvania about ballots and whether election officials themselves were modifying ballots before they were counted. So I would call that a narrow claim as well. So these two claims actually illustrate a way to sort of divide narrow claims into two categories as well. When people academics use the term voter fraud, they're referring to actions taken by voters, but there are also claims that involve election officials, and sometimes those are called election fraud claims. So anyway, the example of Massachusetts voters, the alleged Massachusetts voters and alleged election officials in Pennsylvania illustrate the idea of a narrow claim. You typically find narrow claims in jurisdictions that are close, which is sort of intuitive. I say close, I mean have a close election outcome. So I think that's particularly notable in New Hampshire, is most people consider New Hampshire a purple state where the presidential election historically can be close. Obviously it wasn't particularly close in 2020, but it certainly was in 2016. I think the message I would encourage you to keep in mind about these sort of narrow jurisdiction-specific claims is that you find them in places where you might imagine that if the allegation were true, that it might have been pivotal or pivotal to an election result. In other words, it might have actually changed the results. There's plenty of literature in political science about people studying for evidence of narrow allegations. There's no evidence in the political science literature that systematic voter fraud is a threat to American elections. I'm not going to go into that literature. I'd be happy to take questions on it. But suffice it to say, it's an extensive literature using multiple methodologies. And all of the entrants in literature find basically the same thing, that these sort of jurisdiction-specific claims do not pose any sort of systematic threat to the integrity of American elections. I will now turn to the second type of voter fraud allegation, fraud allegation, and that is what I call systematic. So these, what I'm calling systematic allegations are ones that are not necessarily jurisdiction specific, that rather than, for example, focus on a particular type of action by a particular type of individual, i.e. Massachusetts resident voting improperly in a New Hampshire election, in fact, tar an entire jurisdiction with sort of what you might call a very dense claim. So, for example, what is the sort of systematic claim I'm talking about? That there is a formula in a jurisdiction, i.e. a state, and that formula essentially determines who is going to win the election before the election actually takes place. So this is not a narrow allegation. It's one that, for example, the example I'll give you refers to Nevada, engages an entire state, and rather than focus on particulars of how an alleged act of malfeasance may have taken place, instead refers to some sort of general idea of unfairness, or you might say the system is rigged in a very, very broad sense. So I'm calling these systematic claims. And what we've seen in the past year is growth in systematic claims. So if you look at the literature on voter fraud claims or allegations, prior to 2020, most of them were very focused on narrow, or what I've described as narrow allegations, but now you see an evolution. So what is an example of one of these? I just mentioned Nevada. There was an election contest, and in full disclosure, I served as an expert witness in this case. There was an election contest in Nevada involving the Republican gubernatorial primary, and the second place candidate in that election asserted, as I sort of described earlier, that there was a formula that dictated the election outcome, and that this formula affected the entirety of Nevada. So clearly, this is not a local or a narrow complaint or a narrow allegation. Moreover, this was not a close election. So if you had looked at the Nevada Republican gubernatorial primary and seen the outcome, you probably wouldn't have anticipated that there would be any sort of voter fraud claims made or any sort of claims thereafter, because the election wasn't particularly close. But nonetheless, there was this allegation made of like fundamental malfeasance across the entire state. There was a growth in these sort of claims. I'll defer again to my panelists here about what precisely constitutes a conspiracy, but most people would sort of describe these sort of allegations as conspiracies. Now, you might think that the allegation that there is a formula used by unnamed individuals that dictates election outcomes, you might allege or might think that that is an outlandish claim. Fair enough. Nonetheless, this claim appeared in an actual election contest, which is a legal proceeding in Nevada. So this was an actual challenge by a candidate based on a systematic claim. And the point I think you should take from this is that these systematic claims, while in some sense perhaps easily dismissed on the sense of their being outlandish, actually can have serious effects. So for example, this one was filed in court. It was dismissed somewhat quickly, I would say, but nonetheless it was filed in court. In principle, this would delay certification, and of course it means that public dialogue on the election now reflects this claim. So I think it's important when you think about your deliberations in the committee that you distinguish these two different allegations, two types of allegations, and not dismiss the second type of allegation, the systematic one, even though you might think it's outlandish. But I mean, what I saw in Nevada is that these claims actually are being used, and they're being used in legal proceedings. So I would say that the press is not particularly well equipped to deal with certain systematic claims. One thing I think that you should be aware of, again, in your role in committee, is that sometimes these claims are accompanied with abstruse mathematical logic that seems very, very deep, but actually is a veneer and reflects fundamental misunderstandings of how elections work. So again, I'm not describing a hypothetical. This is literally the type of case that was filed in Nevada. And it is, I think it's not, I don't think the press is well equipped to deal with something like this. The press is certainly well equipped to deal with systematic claims that are investigated by sort of typical reporting methods. So for instance, as you probably know, there were allegations in 2020 that a particular voting machine manufacturer had machines that were contaminated by Venezuela. You may know about this. I presume that you do. This is a claim about the Dominion machines. I've written a paper on this one as well. There's no evidence in favor of that either. It's striking that the press is sort of well equipped to study allegations about the origins of a company, but less well equipped to understand if, say, a 20-page mathematical document really shows anything. And I think that's something to consider about how one communicates with voters about, say, the integrity of elections when charges made against the integrity are grounded in what appears to be some sort of dense analysis that actually is a veneer of sort of a non-analysis. How long have I been speaking? I've lost track. 12 minutes. All right, I'll speak for another few minutes here.
You can go until you're done, Professor.
Thank you. That's always a dangerous thing to say to an academic.
Yeah, we'll tell you when you're done.
Since you have three of them here, let me just mention two things about New Hampshire that I think might be of use in your deliberations in this committee. One is, one of the difficulties of dealing with systematic claims is data availability. So you can see this. In various jurisdictions because across the United States, the types of data that secretaries of state and attorneys general make public vary by state. So in New Hampshire, one of the ways that you see a lot of claims about voter fraud being made now, systematic and narrow, is turns on absentee voting, because there's all this focus on voting by mail. Voting by mail in New Hampshire, voting absentee, is not extremely common because it's restricted in the state, but nonetheless, I just want to point out one feature of New Hampshire election data that might be worth considering, which is that the state does not break down candidate election totals by method of voting. So right now, when, for example, the Secretary of State publishes information on the vote outcomes in Hanover, which is where I live, it doesn't break them down by whether those votes are absentee or election day votes. And I think it would be useful considering whether that may be grounded in statute. So I'll speak here, hypothetically here, but that might be worth thinking about whether that is the sort of breakdown that could be useful. And I would mention there's a double-edged sword here, or the two sides, when you make more data available. One is, and we can see this across the country, when you break down voting returns by method of voting, in an attempt in some sense to deal with arguments about voting in absentee, there are patterns because there is partisan differences in who votes absentee and who votes on election day. Undoubtedly, if New Hampshire were to make those data public, you would see those patterns too. And sometimes those can be seized upon by people to argue that that's evidence of malfeasance, when actually what it is evidence of partisan sorting into methods of voting. So I think data availability here can have this, in some sense, double-edged sword that you should be aware of. As an academic, I think that transparency is always better, more data are better, but nonetheless, you can imagine a situation where a state makes a lot of data available and people seize on the data as evidence of malfeasance when it's an evidence of partisanship. The second, and I'll end in this last point, the second point I would mention is that concerning, say, systematic charges, allegations of fraud, is New Hampshire every 6 months, and the Attorney General of New Hampshire every 6 months issues, I'll call it a report, but I think it's actually a letter to the legislature about the nature of voter integrity, election law investigations in the state. I look at the committee. Are you familiar with this report? Okay, so it exists. So that actually is a very unusual thing across the United States, as you may or may not be aware. Many states don't publish any data about sort of what election law investigations are doing or what exists. So you have this sort of vacuum. And the one suggestion I might want to offer here about these reports is that they're often very dense because they contain documents that actually relate to legal proceedings, some that are redacted, of course, but nonetheless are dense. I think what would be useful in sort of recognizing that systematic claims of fraud really sort of strike against the whole notion of governance is that perhaps making it clear in these reports how many allegations of fraud are dismissed or resolved on the basis of things like clerical errors. So one thing that I know when I speak with voters and with officials is that the officials recognize that in any large process of a lot of millions of people voting or hundreds of thousands as in this state, of course clerical errors come up, and then not to cast aspersions at anyone makes these. There's accompanied a variety of fashions, and making clear, the Attorney General making clear that the percentage of concerns that look problematic or actually just errors that come up in the natural process of elections, maybe that would be a useful thing to do. So one can download these reports from the Attorney General's website, as I've done, and calculate these percentages. It would be nice, I think, if the Attorney General made them very obvious. Anyway, so I think those 2 points about data availability and the point about summarizing these biannual reports sort of speaks to this notion of these 2 types of allegations, narrow and tailored versus systematic. I'm happy to take other questions in the literature and allegations of voter fraud in New Hampshire and beyond. And with that, I'll turn the mic over to Professor Professor Stewart, excuse me.
I think you just gave Professor Nyan a heart attack. I'd also like to thank the commission for inviting me and Senator Merrill for the gracious introduction. And I'd especially like to thank y'all for inviting one of those Massachusetts non-voters in New Hampshire for coming over and talking to y'all about elections. To say a little bit more about me and our work.
On your primary day, but
pardon me?
On your primary.
On my primary day, indeed. Indeed. I will go on. A little bit about me. In addition to being the co-director of the MIT Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project, which has been going since the 2000 election, I'm also the director of the MIT Election Data and Science Lab. Both of these operations are dedicated to the scientific analysis of election administration, what we call sometimes the election science. And as Professor Herron noted, this really is a very MIT sort of thing, very nonpartisan. We work not only with academics, but regularly with election officials, Democrats and Republicans, and neither of the two, to do research, to do consulting when we can, to help make elections better. And that's what we try to do at MIT. And we try, therefore, to make members of both parties happy sometimes and members of both parties angry sometimes. We try to let the analysis fall where it may. The last thing I'll say by way of introduction is that it's a delight to be in New Hampshire and talking about issues of voter confidence and ways in which it can be improved, in part because New Hampshire has been known for particular methods of trying to address voter confidence for many, many years. A good example, and something in the election technology world that I would just highlight, is that your former Secretary of State, Bill Gardner, was kind of a hero in the voting technology community for standing firm in the early days of electronic voting machines, that New Hampshire would never have a voting machine that doesn't have a paper ballot associated with it. That was a long time ago. Electronic voting machines were all the rage. Everybody was getting them, but New Hampshire wasn't going to get them. And I think that ends up, in retrospect, as being a very wise position, taken at a time when the rest of the world was going another way. In a state where live free or die is your state motto, convincing voters of the veracity of the elections has a high bar, and you all have a history of grappling with that and the best way to do that. And so it's a delight to be here. I'm going to talk about two things in my remarks. First of all, I'll say some things about what we know about public opinion and voter confidence from the research that I've done. I will then let Professor Nyan clean up anything that he disagrees with. And then say a bit about voting technology, particularly the most basic of voting technologies, using hands to count ballots. And I have a few words to say about that as well. So, and the general takeaways of these two sections of my remarks are, first of all, in the area of voter confidence, is that we need to be, I urge caution in imagining how election administration or changes to election administration can be utilized to increase voter confidence. I know of no major voting reform for the last 20 years that has increased voter confidence in measurable ways. And I advise advocates and legislators and others, when they're thinking about improving elections, to focus on the improvement they seek to enjoy in terms of greater efficiency, cost savings, accuracy, transparency. There are a number of really good practices and best practices, and to think about those practices, because there are ways in which actually the confidence part of that within public opinion can backfire even. So to be very, I would say, be very modest about what we think that changes to rules, laws, practices can accomplish. And then with respect to technology, separately, there's a similar warning that I would just say at the beginning, which is to be wary of making changes to technologies or actually to any administrative proceedings without careful study ahead of time and measurement and study as they evolve. That there are unintended consequences to many, many changes to technology and practices, and it's important to roll them out slowly, do pilots, do those sorts of things before rolling out something for the entire state. So let me say a few things about voter confidence. My experience in studying voter confidence at the mass level has centered around a survey that I administer. I started administering it after every federal election, starting in 2008, called the Survey of the Performance of American Elections. That's a survey of 200 adults in every state plus the District of Columbia, so 10,200 adults. Most of them are voters. Actually, they're registered voters. We ask them questions about their experience voting, and that's really the core of this survey, asking them their experience when they went to vote. But we also ask people, the respondents, how confident are you that your vote was counted as you intended, votes in your city or county, votes in your state, and votes nationwide? And that set of questions has also become kind of the standard way that political scientists ask about voter confidence. So it's a common question, way of asking it. We can talk about better or worse ways of asking the question. But one of the things that I'm able to do is talk about voter confidence as it varies across time, as it varies across demographics, as it varies across all sorts of features that we would be interested in. So I have 6 things that I would say are takeaways, and you can tell me when I'm done. The first thing, and this is, I think, echoing something that Professor Herring was saying, that when we think about public confidence in elections, we need to be very careful about what we're talking about. That voters, and I'll give some specifics with the other points, but you can ask voters, do you feel that elections are free and fair? Do you believe that democracy works in America? Do you believe that your vote was counted as you intended? And the further away the target of the question is, the more abstract the question is, the more likely it is that people will be grumpy. The more particular the question is, and the closer to the voter, the less likely they will be grumpy. Okay? So keep that in mind in thinking about claims about voter confidence or things you read about voter confidence in the mass public. Second point I would make is that voter confidence is greatest at the local level and the lowest at the national level. Give you an example. In the 2020 Survey of the Performance of American Elections, or the SPAE, I'll refer to it as the SPAE, I asked the question, how confident are you that your votes were counted as intended in the 2020 election? 67% nationwide said that they were very confident that their vote was counted as intended. 22% said that they were somewhat confident. Add those two together, that's about 90% said that they were confident that their vote was counted as intended. If you ask, we asked them, how confident are you that votes nationwide were counted as intended? 37% said that they were very confident, and 22% said that they were somewhat confident. Okay, so a majority, but still a much smaller majority, said that they were confident. And if you go to the state or the county, it gets smaller and smaller as you go across. As an aside, I can pull out, because I have 200 people from New Hampshire, I can pull them out. And in 2020, I'll just report, New Hampshire voters, when you ask them about their vote, their city or county's vote, and the state's vote, they were about 5 to 10 points more confident than the nation as a whole. So New Hampshire voters tend to be more confident than voters nationwide. They were no different than voters in the rest of the country when you ask them, how confident are you that votes nationwide were counted as intended? But when you ask them about things closer to home, they were more confident than the rest of the country. So that's point number 2. Point number 3, voters are more confident when their candidate wins. So in 2020, for instance, Democrats, 61% in the nation, 61% in the nation of Democrats said that they were very confident that votes nationwide were counted as intended. The number for Republicans, do we want to pick up that? 8%. Okay. Democrats, 61%, Republicans, 8%. That's how they thought about elections nationwide. Republican respondents, New Hampshire respondents were very similar. In 2016, only 29% of Democrats said they thought votes nationwide were counted as intended. So for Democrats, it went from 29% to 61%. I would argue simply because of who won the election. For Republicans, it went from 28% in 16 to 8% in 20. I would argue largely because of who won the election. Okay, so when your guy wins, you feel good. An interesting aside that in 2020 there was a new phenomenon that again y'all are very aware of by being attuned to these sorts of things, is that in states where the election was particularly close in 2020, Republicans were less confident than in states that were not close. And in states where Donald Trump lost, they were really not confident about the nation, about their locality, or about their state. Interestingly enough, and by the way, I will provide written testimony so you can actually look at the numbers and ask me more detailed questions. New Hampshire stood out as a state where, despite the fact that the election was close, Donald Trump lost New Hampshire. New Hampshire Republicans stood out in terms of how confident they were in the survey that their vote was counted as intended, and that votes in the state were counted as intended. They were less confident than Democrats, but nationwide, New Hampshire Republicans were amazingly, when you see the chart, you will be amazed. Point number four about my research and voter confidence. Voter confidence is greatest when one has a good experience, personal experience voting. If your poll worker is considered to be competent, if you wait a short period of time, if your voting machine works, if you have an easy time finding your polling place, you will be more confident than if you had the opposite of those things. These 2 points I've just said leads to my advice oftentimes, and I used to joke about this, I can't joke about this as much anymore, that if you want your voters to be confident, make sure of 2 things. Make sure they have a good experience, and make sure their guy wins. And presumably they have control over only one of those. I have a point about voter fraud that I want to skip over in the interest of time. Actually, no, I will say a little bit about this. The interesting thing I find in my research is that it's certainly the case. We ask people how often they think certain types of fraud occur in their state. And not surprisingly, people who say that fraud is common in their state are less confident. But it's not that they're less confident about their own state. They're less confident about the nation. So there's something really interesting and complicated about how voters parse information about elections and turn that into confidence. It looks like they're taking in information about the nation, most of which doesn't apply to them. They're seeing, yikes! Over there must be problematic. Here it's pretty good. Okay. So even people who think there's a lot of fraud in the world still think that their own voting, they are confident about it. Point number 6, I think it's number 6. Reforms, as I said earlier, reforms intended to improve confidence rarely achieve it. The most research in this area has been in the area of voter ID laws. There's been claims in the Supreme Court, there's claims by advocates, there's all sorts of claims out there. I've contributed to this literature, and colleagues have contributed to this literature. Voter ID, passing a voter ID law, whether it's a good idea or not, and I'm not passing judgment on that, but there's no evidence that passing a strict voter ID law increases the confidence of voters in the state. Why is that? Well, the reason for that finding, which is probably the reason behind the other findings that voting reforms rarely change confidence, is that by the time a voting reform becomes highly salient in a state, it's also become highly partisan. And so what I think to the advocates and legislators and others think of in terms of confidence, voters are parsing in terms of partisanship. And so what oftentimes happens, say in the case of voter ID laws, where we know the best, you will see in a state that confidence won't change when they pass the law. What you will see is the people who favored the law now become more confident, but the people who oppose the law become less confident. And so you need to think about the potential to polarize things because of especially the polarized confidence with these reforms. Let me finish by saying, actually, one last thing about confidence, and I'll talk about hand-counted paper ballots. Now, the evidence I just talked about is based on a survey I did right after 2020, and I will be the first to acknowledge that a lot has happened since November 2020 when we did this survey. And the research in this area is just beginning to unfold. Very little of it has been published. It is certainly the case. My hypothesis, by the way, the thing to think about is that not necessarily that confidence has dropped, but that emotions have risen. So it used to be the case that when your guy lost, you became grumpy. Nah, we lost and we should have won, but there was probably some fraud someplace. Now, the losers, or at least a small number of the losers, aren't grumpy anymore. They've gone beyond grumpy. And that's leading to action that we've never seen before. FOIA requests, threats of violence, and those sorts of things. And the media is reinforcing those sorts of expressions of dissatisfaction because that's the sort of thing that sells newspapers and clicks. A few words about hand-counting paper ballots. A couple of things here about my background here. I've been studying both the accuracy of hand counting versus using scanners to count ballots for a couple of decades now, myself or vicariously through colleagues. And I've also been studying the public opinion around how people think about technologies. Not only hand counting paper, but also scanning, DREs, and other things. So let me just very quickly run down what we found there. First of all, the public opinion. Before 2020, despite, this is kind of an interesting thing about how public opinion interacts with voting technology. Before 2020, despite the fact that activists and good government types had been attacking electronic voting machines, the ones that look like ATMs, relentless attack for 20 years, it was still the case that those machines are the most popular among the electorate. Nationwide, even in counties where they do scanning, most of those voters wish they had DREs. Despite the fact that you or I could spend 2 minutes with them and tell them why they don't want DREs, and they would change their minds. Nonetheless, in the public's eye, as much technology as possible is a good thing. Again, cautionary tale about following public opinion in some of these choices. Partisanship played very little role in how respondents viewed different voting machines, with one exception. Up until 2020, counting ballots by hand was largely an issue on the left side of the political spectrum. That's changed, but it used to be almost entirely on the left side of the political spectrum. Finally, confidence in that votes were counted as intended was unrelated to the voting machines people used. The one way that technology got involved in confidence is that we had some research back in the aughts that when you changed the way that ballots were counted, confidence went down. It didn't matter what you changed from or to, it was the change itself. Interesting, we didn't talk about why that is. I was interested in if that had changed because of the movement toward counting ballots by hand, and as Senator Merrill was mentioning, I wrote something for the Washington Post about this a few months ago. So I did another survey back in April where I asked people what sort of voting machines they preferred and some other standard public opinion types of questions. And this is what I found. It's still the case when you ask people, you run them through different types of voting machines. What type of voting machine would you prefer to vote on? The plurality winner is electronic voting machines, followed by scanners, followed by hand counting paper. In 2019, and it was virtually unchanged from 2019. So in 2020, so before the election to now, virtually unchanged. However, it's changed by party. In 2019, before this became an issue, 13% of Republicans said that they would prefer to vote hand-counted paper ballots. A couple of months ago, my survey, it had risen to 20%. Among Democrats, in 2019, it was 15% of Democrats said that they would prefer to vote by hand or have hand-counted paper. Now it's down to 10%. Furthermore, if you break down the sample to those who follow news a lot versus those who don't follow the news a lot, Republicans, 31% of the Republicans who follow the news a lot, so half of the Republicans, 31% of them say that they would prefer to vote on a hand-counted paper ballot. Only 9% of Democrats said that's how they would prefer to vote. So the more attentive people are getting, the more attentive people are to politics, the greater the partisan polarization over this issue. So that's the public opinion. On accuracy, there have been 2 studies of which I am aware, 2 scientific studies in the literature, that have compared hand-counted paper versus scanners for accuracy. One was based on recounts in New Hampshire. There was a study by a former colleague of mine, Stephen Ansalva here, and Andrew Reeves, who studied the New Hampshire recount statistics and data from 1946 to 2002 in general, and then they focused specifically on the recounts from 2000 to 2004, and they looked at all of the variances from the initial count to the recount. This is what they found. On average, when ballots were initially counted by hand, in the recount there is on average a 2% mean absolute difference between the original count and the recount. 2% average deviation. With the scanners, it was a 1% average absolute deviation. Okay? The other research was done by myself and some colleagues about Wisconsin. Wisconsin had 2 recounts, 2011 and 2016, same methodology, and we discovered the same thing in Wisconsin. The only difference is that Wisconsin errors overall were much smaller than they were in New Hampshire. Of an order of hand-counted paper in New Hampshire, the mean average difference was 0.2%. The scanners, it was 0.1%. Now, one of the things that's come out of this research that I think is really important for thinking about hand counting, whether one is going to switch to hand counting or not, or just improve hand counting, is that the big issue that showed up both in the Wisconsin study and in the New Hampshire study is that with hand counting, yes, human beings are not as good at tedious things as computers are. But the other thing that was discovered is that human beings are more readily non-compliant with counting rules. Okay? In Wisconsin, the problem was getting humans to count write-in votes. In New Hampshire, there was at least one case, it's actually not in the paper, but I knew the people who studied this, so I got the inside story. There was one town, there's a great story, there's one town where many years ago, the counting board just assumed, apparently, that one of the candidates was going to win. It was getting late, and they just stopped counting. And there was a recount, and it was discovered, the big discrepancy. So, we do logic and accuracy testing of scanners. We don't do logic and accuracy testing of human beings. And that's an issue. So, I will stop here. I've talked way too long. I will note, though, that if we have some time later on, that one of the ways of dealing with concerns about accuracy may very well be with thinking about the auditing regime in the state. New Hampshire is one of only about 5 states that doesn't have automatic post-election audits. You do have other opportunities for auditing. There was a very thorough report this last election because of problems with scanned paper ballots in one of your towns. And so you all have ways of doing systematic, legally sanctioned audits. But one of the things one might think about for increasing the confidence and the trustworthiness of the elections might be something about auditing of all these systems. But I would just end by, again, the cautions about putting too many eggs in the voter confidence basket in terms of in terms of recommending reforms and in overestimating the ability of technological changes to reach enormous changes. So thank you. Thank you for your time.
All right. Hi, everyone. Hear me okay? My name is Brendan Nyhan. I'm the third academic in this panel, and it's an honor to be with you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'd like to make 3 points today in the time that I have. And I'm a political scientist who does not study election administration like my distinguished colleagues here. I study public opinion and political psychology. So what I'll be speaking to you about today are the factors that affect public confidence in elections and voting as I understand them as a specialist in public opinion and political psychology. So I'll defer to my colleagues on the details of election administration and so forth and really speak about what the scientific research tells us about the factors that affect the beliefs people express and the opinions they endorse, particularly as it comes to the integrity of our elections here in the United States. Okay, so I'm going to make 3 points to you today. I'm going to tell you them right up front. The first one is as follows. The public is not attentive to the details of politics, but they do respond to messages that they receive from political elites, especially the ones on their own side of the aisle. Okay, so when one party says an election was stolen, people who support that party will tend to endorse that point of view. And importantly, it's often going to be the people who are most attentive to politics who are most likely to echo that view that's been expressed by elites, even though in other cases, in other ways, those people may actually be more knowledgeable about politics and elections than other members of the public. So this is not simply a matter of people being better informed. In some cases, it's the people who are most informed who are most likely to endorse these kinds of messages that are promoted by political elites. So I think that has important implications for thinking about the nature of the problem. It's not simply a matter of a lack of factual information, it's about the messages people are hearing from folks on their side of interest. Okay. The second point I'll make to you is that we have extensive evidence from both public opinion surveys and scientific experiments demonstrating the effects of these kinds of messages from partisan elites. Voter confidence plummeted after the 2020 election when Donald Trump said the election was stolen and sought to overturn it. The decrease we observed was, not surprisingly, concentrated among Republicans, as the prior logic and theory I was describing to you would suggest. And experimental research demonstrates in an even more specific way how exposure to those kinds of claims will drive down belief in the integrity of elections. And I've conducted several studies of that type. Finally, I'll speak briefly about an experiment we conducted showing that describing the results of an official audit did modestly increase voter confidence in elections. I don't think it's a panacea for all the reasons Professor Stewart was describing, but given that it seems valuable for assuring the integrity of elections anyway, there might be a possible win-win there, so I thought it was at least worth mentioning to the committee. Okay, so the research I'm going to be describing to you has been published in scientific journals or reported by Brightline Watch, which is a nonpartisan watchdog of democracy that my colleagues and I have organized. All of these data and research are public, and I'd be happy to share the details with anyone. And the last thing I'll say is, unless otherwise specified, all the data I'm going to share with you is at the national level. It's very expensive to do the kind of state-by-state public opinion surveys that Professor Stewart was describing, so these will typically be national surveys. But I think the conclusions should apply quite straightforwardly to New Hampshire with some of the possible caveats that his testimony would suggest. Okay, so the first point, remember, I wanted to make to you is that the public is inattentive, but they tend to respond to messages from political elites. Okay. So our field of political science has shown for decades now how little people know when you ask them basic factual questions about politics. But we've also found that when high volume sustained messages from political elites are disseminated, they do tend to affect public opinion. Okay. And there's a simple stylized model is as follows. If those messages are unified, in other words, so think for instance of the aftermath of the September 11 terrorist attacks, when Democrats and Republicans stood together and rallied against the threat to the country. When elite messages are unified in that way, we can get a kind of a shift in the direction of that message among both parties. But when those messages are divided along partisan lines, as we so often see, we'll tend to observe, of course, a polarization in public opinion. And as I told you earlier, that polarization will often be greatest among the folks who are most attentive to politics, because they'll be most likely to hear those messages from elites and to integrate them into their own belief system. Okay? This, I think, highlights the danger when it comes to our elections. We have depended on that bipartisan consensus I described to you, where after the elections, both sides, right, however grumpy they may be, at least at the elite level, have broadly affirmed the legitimacy of the elections. They've agreed to play by the rules of those elections, and they've acknowledged the legitimacy of the process that generated an outcome, even if it's one that they didn't want to have happen. Now we've seen something different, and something that has no recent precedent in American political history, which is the elites of one side rejecting the legitimacy of that process at a fundamental level. And that opens up the door to the kind of partisan polarization we've seen in perceptions of election integrity, which, again, has no recent precedent, and it, to my mind, goes beyond the kind of winner effects Professor Stewart was describing. We would certainly expect, and indeed we saw after 2016, the winning side to become more confident in elections. Right? So after Donald Trump won, Republicans, if I recall correctly, did express more confidence in the election system. Right? So we would expect Democrats in turn to become more confident when Joe Biden won after 2020. But what we've seen that we didn't see in those prior elections was a sustained attack on the integrity of the election itself, driving down confidence in the legitimacy of that result. And again, there's no recent precedent. John McCain didn't do this. Mitt Romney didn't do this. John Kerry didn't do this, right? And we can go through statements that people have objected to, that folks like Hillary Clinton or Stacey Abrams made after their defeat, but they do not compare in any way in their volume or prominence to a sitting president rejecting the results of an election itself. Okay? And that's had a devastating effect on public confidence in elections among Republicans. And I want to be really clear about it. My colleagues are real pioneers in election science and have given you a deep dive into some of the important parts of that. But I think we should be even more clear that there is no expert's belief in widespread fraud in our field. Full stop. These claims were rejected by courts again and again and again, including by Donald Trump's own judicial appointees. There is no evidence of widespread fraud, period. And we need to be really clear about that. And yet, because of these polarized political messages I was describing to you, we saw belief that, for instance, Joe Biden was the rightful winner of the election, driven down to just 9% in November 2021 among people who strongly approved of Donald Trump's performance in office. Right? 9%. And confidence in the election count in people's state decreased from 77% before the election to 64% afterwards. These are polling numbers immediately before and immediately after. So we're talking about October to November of 2020. And from 56% at the national level to 28% afterwards among Trump approvers. Okay. So exactly as Professor Stewart described, people are most distrustful of those national results. But in particular, it's those Republicans who were told that they should distrust the election who are, in fact, distrusting of the election results. Okay. And as Professor Stewart described to you, these beliefs are closely associated with unsupported beliefs in massive levels of fraud that have never been documented in any legal proceeding of any kind. Thousands upon thousands. When you ask people, we actually ask for specific numbers. In what range do you think different types of voter and election fraud take place? How often did they take place in this election? And we found approximately 8 in 10 Republicans saying thousands of cases of each type of fraud we asked about or more. Just because there is no evidence, anything close to that, coming out of our court or legal system, despite intensive searching for such evidence. Okay. Now, again, one might think this might have been sour grapes. Someone lost an election and people complain afterwards and they search for reasons to explain why they lost. But things will get better. Things will change. People will forget. People will come to accept the result. That was a story that we told ourselves after the 2020 election. And there's no evidence it's the case. In fact, precisely the opposite. We've seen no movement in acceptance of Joe Biden as the rightful winner of the election among Republicans. And it's precisely because these kinds of messages calling into question the legitimacy of the 2020 result have continued. So we've been stuck at about 1 in 4 Republicans accepting that Joe Biden is the rightful winner of the election across the 3 polls we conducted in 2020. Looking forward, we see when we surveyed people in November of last year, asked them about their confidence in the 2022 election campaign, we saw more polarization in those beliefs than we observed just before the 2020 election. Okay? So this is not simply a one-off. This is not something that, the polarization we're observing over election integrity is not simply limited to the 2020 election itself. We were seeing polarization, higher levels of polarization in perceptions of the 2022 count than we saw immediately prior to the election. And this was at a time when Republican prospects in the 2022 midterm looked extremely favorable. Okay? So just to put some numbers on that, in October of 2020, when we asked people about their level of confidence in the national vote count using Professor Stewart's survey question he described to you, 66% of Democrats expressed confidence in the national election count, compared to 58% of Republicans, okay? 58% of Republicans, less than 2 years ago. And this just happened. This is not something that's always been true. 58% of Republicans, October of 2020, even as Donald Trump was starting to ramp up his campaign, questioning the legitimacy of that election result, 58% of Republicans expressed confidence in the national election. But by November of 2021, a little more than a year later, 80% of Democrats expressed confidence in the 2022 national vote count, much higher, but only 42% of Republicans. Okay, so a substantial decrease on the Republican side. Again, I want to emphasize that this issue is a live one and ongoing. 538, the news website you may be familiar with, released a tally today, finding that 37% of the Republicans running for the House of Representatives, the US Senate, or governor or attorney general, 37% of them fully deny the legitimacy of the 2020 election, and an additional 12% have raised questions about the results. So about half of the top of the ticket candidates, I think I left out Attorney General, House, Senate, Governor, Secretary of State, and Attorney General. And approximately half of those candidates on the Republican side deny or question legitimacy of the 2020 election results. So there's every reason to worry about not just continued attacks on legitimacy of the 2020 election, but the 2022 election, and especially the 2024 election. Okay? So now, one can say, well, this is just because, why do people distrust the election? There are many stories. I don't want to say that these messages are the only factor, but I'll argue they're the main difference. Okay? People have always lost elections, right? We've all lived through many, and we've seen both sides lose. But there's something different about this one, okay? And what's different is the volume and frequency of these baseless claims of fraud. Okay? And so my colleagues and I have conducted 2 experiments now, one that was published in the Journal of Experimental Political Science, one that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, showing that exposure to unsupported claims of voter fraud drive down confidence in the election system. We tested this in the aftermath of the 2018 election, and we tested it during the fall general election campaign before the 2020 election. Okay? In both cases, we found these effects were concentrated among the folks we would expect to be most predisposed to endorse those claims. Because they were coming from Republicans, it was Republicans and Trump approvers. Okay. So, I unfortunately can speak for in much more detail about the nature of the problem and how to solve it. So I don't have a magic elixir to offer you on how to restore confidence in our election system. I think Professor Stewart is absolutely right to raise questions about the idea that technology or legal changes will magically fix this. I don't think there's any reason to think that based on the public opinion research that's been conducted. What we need are both parties to affirm the legitimacy of the election system. And I will say, drawing back to this point again, that confidence is highest at the local level. That may need to be built from the grassroots up rather than the top down, right? People have the most confidence in their local election results. They need to hear from those folks in their area that they trust, that this election was conducted in a legitimate and fair manner. Then they need to hear from that. They need to hear that from folks at the state level. right? And if all the folks in the states are affirming that, then you have a better chance at the national level. There's no magic, right? Americans have always been skeptical of the federal government and things happening further away from them and their lives. But that, getting back to that partisan consensus is going to be the most critical factor. I don't think there is any magic solution, whether it's technology or legal change. But I'll give you one small glimmer of hope, something that surprised me. And that is when my colleagues and I randomized exposure to information about the election audits conducted in Maricopa County, Arizona. We found some encouraging results. You recall this is the place where there were first a series of official audits after the election was concluded, verifying the results that Joe Biden did in fact, track the number of votes that were reported there, confirming the legitimacy of his statewide election, his statewide victory in Arizona. When we randomized exposure to details of all the audit steps that had been taken to verify the legitimacy of those results, we did find, at least in this relatively artificial context, Republicans expressing much greater confidence in the legitimacy of the results there. Okay, it increased from 22% in a case where they didn't read any information about the election audit to 48% when they did. Now, could that withstand a sustained attack from folks on their side of the aisle attacking the legitimacy of the results? Probably not. But nonetheless, I was encouraged. And let me offer one other reason why it might be important. I would suspect, and I think that the reporting in Maricopa County would back this up, that that process helped hold in place the local Republicans who so bravely defended the legitimacy of their election results when they were being called into question, often at great cost to their own political futures. So it may not be that the effectiveness of audits are simply in their effects on the public themselves. Of course, audits, the idea of an election audit is a very abstract and foreign concept to most people in their everyday experiences. But if it helps those elected officials and election administrators testify with confidence across party lines to the legitimacy of their results, it may have some value in protecting voter confidence. So, just to summarize, what I want to emphasize is the role of political elites in shaping voter confidence, the damage that's been done by the messages that the American people have been told by political elites in the time since the 2020 election, and the importance of restoring that bipartisan consensus to increase election confidence back to the levels we previously enjoyed, and hopefully a less polarized version of that confidence. Thanks.
Any questions from the panel? Kevin.
Thank you all for coming and speaking today. Let's see here. So we started off with narrow and systematic fraud. I thought that was very well put, because what people's understanding is of what is fraud, somebody coming over the border, voting, but they might have a house in New Hampshire. We heard from the Attorney General last week, our last meeting, that there was some confusion. They might vote in a state and a federal election in Massachusetts, but they have a house at Newfound Lake and they want the local issue. I want to go for my local property tax, so they go to the local issue. Now, as for cleaning down, and I kind of cornered Chairman Buckley of the Democratic Party on this question 2 meetings ago, of understanding that there was voter fraud in New Hampshire, and it was proven cases that went to court. I think one way, and again, you've all kind of spelled it out, of explaining to people to get more confidence in numbers, is saying there has been voter fraud, proven in court cases. Moving forward, we found out X, Y, and Z, and we're going to improve upon it. By letting voters know that there has been problems, again, the Windham audit proved that the discrepancies of the folding machine, again, a folding machine was a huge problem when people were like, again, no malicious intent, but just to speed up the process. So identifying the problem can bring confidence to people. So that's one thing I think that your presentations of the percentages of people, of how it's presented, whether it's Trump speaking at a podium or if it's the chairman of the Democratic Party, there's two different messages there. Getting a concise message between the two would be extremely hard to get there for them to talk together, but to get people to understand that, yes, there was some problems, we've identified them, and moving forward, how to fix the problems, but I think improve percentages. And a comment on that, if you guys could.
There's another, I think, good example of states kind of pointing out, trying to put some hard numbers on fraud and showing that they're serious about the issue. One that stands up in my mind is Ohio, where it appears there's now a regular practice with the Secretary of State of every year reporting the results of their audits, their estimates of what looks to be on the face of it, say double voting and those sorts of things, and then they run through the numbers about how all those cases are resolved, right? And it turns out that, as is always the case, the great majority of those cases are administrative errors, those sorts of things, and then here are the 3 or 4 cases that were legitimate, and we went after them. So I'm sure that there are other states that have similar practices to be as transparent as possible, to acknowledge the fraud. And I think that's, by the way, we've been putting shade on Republicans more often than Democrats, but I think that it's probably a mistake on the left to suggest there is no, in fact, it is a mistake empirically to say there is no fraud. The issue here is to acknowledge it, put hard numbers on it, and to demonstrate that something's happening, and there's a lot of ways of doing it. The second thing I would say, just to endorse the general idea, and this is also echoing what Professor Nyan was saying, one of the things I noticed, and I talked to an awful lot of local and state election officials, is that having this procedure to be able to stand by, that Democratic and Republican election officials within a state, they're all running elections the same way. And so when there's an issue that arises in a state about a problem, they can all speak to what the problem is. And they can all speak with one voice about how you resolve it. And that is one of the ways in which, it seems to me that, and I'm sure this happens in New Hampshire, but I think it would be, again, I don't know about a particular case here in New Hampshire, but opportunities to raise the voices or amplify the voices of city and town clerks as they talk together about how recounts are handled, how controversies are handled, if they are seen as speaking in parallel, right, and speaking with a common vocabulary, that's something that I would bet you, if we could study that, would be reassuring to voters.
My quick follow-up also?
Yes, please, sir.
So another state I think that you might look at is North Carolina. So they do a similar thing as what Professor Stewart mentioned about tracking various allegations. They break them down by types, and I believe that's every year, maybe every 2 years. And that's also very valuable. It was sort of along the lines of what I was thinking about New Hampshire, about sort of creating some more digestible summary. North Carolina is also an important state because this is the locus of probably the worst case of voter fraud in the past, 30 years. In the United States that had, I don't know if you're familiar with it, this was the case where there was, in the 9th Congressional District, some documented fraud when the election was actually thrown out. And so the fact that North Carolina has this sort of transparency, I think it sends a very good signal about a state that is open about what happened and is trying to document for citizens, steps that are being taken.
Now, I'll echo everything they just said and just add, I would be cautious, though, to emphasize the denominator in providing any of these statistics, because as we saw, for instance, in Florida, one can easily come up with a handful of isolated examples and suggest there's some large-scale pattern, but in fact, we're talking about 0.0001% or whatever the figure might be. So I guess, I'm very open to this kind of transparency argument, but it's easy to forget that numbers and percentages aren't always people's strong suit, and if we give them a bunch of highly salient examples, they may generalize from them in ways that the data don't support. So it's very important to say, here are the cases that we really have, we're prosecuting them, we're holding people accountable, and they reflect some tiny percentage of the actual number of votes cast.
Thank you for your testimony. I have a couple of questions for you. So I'm struggling with how to frame this one because I understand the message that you're all jointly trying to portray, and yet, with the issue of bringing up concerns about elections. And, I've sat on this committee with 7 other people, and this is our 9th meeting, and I've heard people come up and say that we have no issues at all with our elections, that they're run free and fair, and that they have 100% confidence. And I've heard people come up and express concerns, and some of those people, many of those people have provided written documentation to back up their concerns. I don't perceive their concerns as being conspiracy theories. I perceive them as something that should be looked into. And while there is a high level of confidence, as you're saying, in our statewide elections, there are a lot of people who don't have confidence, and that's really why this committee was formed, was to address a specific concern, and kudos to Secretary Scanlon for meeting this head-on. I don't know of any other state that is showing any concerns to the voters of their states and their confidence in their elections, and I really think that he deserves a huge amount of praise for that. But perceptions and reality don't always align, and if the perceptions are wrong, I don't think that, I think that they have to be addressed. So the point I'm making is that, there are issues in some towns in the state. I'm from Windham, and you seem to be aware of the issues that took place in Windham. It took thousands of hours of my time and other people's time in order to convince the state to do the audit. And for me, that was a frustrating process because we had a huge numerical discrepancy between election day and the recount. And I wanted to know why. I never used a word for it. I never even made any assumptions as to what the issue might be. I simply wanted to know what the cause of the discrepancy was. So there are issues in other towns as well. Windham, Bedford, Merrimack, Nottingham, and Concord all have issues in the news recently. 3 of those towns will have election monitors appointed to them. That's a very, very, very serious thing that the AG's office engages in. It's very rare for that to happen. So those are legitimate issues for people to have a lack of confidence. So I guess, and then one of the towns, the AG told the moderator to resign, and he did. So very, very egregious problems. So I just wanted to make that statement. But I want to make sure that I understand what you're saying, because I'm listening to you very carefully. I wanted to preference my question with those statements. We've had people who come up and they express concerns. They show evidence, and then people get up after them and simply claim that they were gaslighting, and that the Secretary of State should shut this committee down because all that those people were doing was adding fuel to the fire, that there should be concerns about our elections, and that we should summarily dismiss what they said. How would you suggest we handle those situations?
I'll start. Give my colleagues some time to think about it. I think what you're talking about is a serious issue. And so let me couch my answer with a general response and then maybe something specific. The general response is this. As I mentioned earlier, I spent a lot of time to talk to state and local officials. And in the last few months, I've found myself in meetings with state legislators, secretaries of state, directors of elections at the state and local level, chairs of legislative committees, mostly Republicans, and mostly from red states. And the interesting thing I found in those conversations is that they're especially prone to get a lot of things thrown at them that are not, basically are feeding on conspiracy theories out there. And they're spending that time, kind of dealing with folks who are probably much less informed about things than what you're talking about. But as a consequence of having to manage that, they're unable to get to the real questions facing their states. Right? And I think that's, as a geek, election geek myself, that is one of the tragedies of the position that we're in right now, is that for folks who are not attentive to this world, when you see people defend the election system or point out something wrong, it's easy to just assume that that's just kind of partisan, brickbats being thrown around. And it is a problem for those, and I assume it's everybody in this room, certainly the commission and people at this table, who want elections to be improved based on evidence. And it's certainly the case. If this were another time, in fact, watching from New Hampshire, watching what's happening in New Hampshire from Massachusetts, I recognize some of these issues, such as the folding incident and some of these others, that seem to recur in New Hampshire, seem to be common problems in states that administer their elections at the local level, for instance. And these are states like Massachusetts and Wisconsin and Michigan that have challenges of small jurisdictions, managing technology, managing processes, when they may not have the personnel or the capacity really to do that at a level that we expect in this day and time, given our expectations in life and given technology and everything else. I think it's a real struggle in New Hampshire, and it's probably hard to talk about. Well, how do you decide whether to hand count or use scanners? I mean, there are trade-offs, right? I mean, there's cost and accuracy. I mean, there are these trade-offs. I mean, it's not just everybody should have a scanner. It's that these trade-offs need to be carefully considered. And in this environment, it's very hard to do that. So hopefully my colleagues have something more specific to say, but the first thing I wanted to say is I think your general point is a really important one. And that one of the reasons I'm eager to find ways around the current kind of rhetorical situation we're in is that it is clear that throughout the country we can do better, even in places that are doing pretty good. And sometimes confidence is misplaced. And wouldn't it be great if we could get back to back to a world in which we're very careful with the metrics, very careful about what we're trying to achieve, and then try to achieve those things in kind of a scientific, data-driven way. And I think the way we are, what we're in right now is until we can deal with this kind of rhetorical black cloud hanging over elections, it's going to be very difficult for those of us who want to be election engineers to make those processes work and to address the questions that I think are real in many of these towns that we talk about. Those towns that are essentially in receivership and the places that may continue to have problems with their voting technology. There's no doubt that those are real issues that need to be addressed, but it's hard in this environment. And so anyway, I resonate to the comment, and just encourage y'all to nonetheless to think about this environment as being something we need to kind of get through so that we can get to these actual problems of elections in every state of the country that still need to be addressed.
I think your question you asked of the committee was, does your committee, asked of us at the panel, does your committee sort of raise issues that we should engage in, and so should you be shut down? Is that sort of how I would interpret your comments?
No, we're getting feedback from certain people who have testified that have dismissed what other people have said, regarding issues and concerns that they've raised. They've said that that those people are simply gaslighting, that they just summarily dismiss whatever evidence they believe to be accurate. And I wanted to know what your thoughts were, because what you're saying is we need to proceed cautiously. We don't want to pour gas on the fire. And yet, I believe that there have been valid concerns that have been raised, and I don't believe personally that those concerns should be summarily dismissed, and that they need to be looked into and given the due diligence and respect that I would give the testimony of anybody who came before this panel. And, I'm asking for your thoughts on that.
I would say that several thoughts, John, looking at my notes here. In an election, there are hundreds of thousands of people doing something, voting, across the country, millions. So when you use the word like issues or concerns, one reaction I would have if I were in your shoes and someone were to come to me and say, we have a concern about some jurisdiction or something, some set of voters. I can't think of any, I would say two things. One, any human operation involving hundreds of thousands of people will, of course, have issues and concerns. And so the fact that elections do strikes me as no different than any other collective activity in which we engage. The second point I would make, so the first one is like this is just normal human behavior. Of course, there might be different interpretations of rules in some places, for example. The second point I would mention is that this is the reason we have an Attorney General's office. And I mention that because in my interactions with various voters in, say, different jurisdictions across the country, and looking at various claims that have been made in court and not in court, is there's often this sense that elections are a free-for-all. And I've always been struck by how anyone could really believe that. But it seems like there is that sense in some areas. So, for example, one saw in 2020 all sorts of claims made about vote-by-mail ballots that simply were inconsistent with the fact that jurisdictions track vote-by-mail ballots. And so, even if you went hypothetically to one of your neighbors and grabbed that person's ballot from his or her mailbox and put it in your own envelope, the election officials would notice this. So what I'm saying is that the existence of all these procedures that New Hampshire has and other states have are very important. And the sense that there's this sort of free-for-all in election administration is a false one. So I think one thing, again, if I were in your shoes, would be to emphasize that, in fact, New Hampshire has procedures that work to support the integrity of elections, and we have an Attorney General and a Secretary of State. And these offices, one of their roles is, in fact, to ensure that laws are followed. Again, nothing to do with elections, just generically true. And even that point is sometimes lost on people. The fact that New Hampshire assembles, as I've mentioned and we've talked about, reports on election integrity and alleged violations of election law. If anyone were to come to me and say, "Oh, I'm concerned about New Hampshire," the first thing I would do is say, "Yes, that's fine. Why don't you see what the Attorney General is doing?" And that's a sign of transparency. I think it could be improved a little bit, as I've suggested, but nonetheless, that is a sign of transparency, and it really places, I think, the concerns in context, which is that most of them turned out to be clerical errors or issues where someone registered to vote, voted in an election, and 3 days after election moved, which is of course completely legitimate, but looks like someone who voted in an improper jurisdiction if you don't think carefully about it. So I would tell these, I think the role of this committee is an important one. And If I were in your shoes, I would address these concerns head on, saying we have organizations in the state that do it, and that elections are like any other part of collective activity. They'll have their bumps now and then, and that's why we have state institutions to deal with problems.
I'll build right on that and just say it's really important to have confidence in the process by which these concerns can be handled. I think none of us would dismiss any serious evidence of fraud or disenfranchisement. Of course, we're empiricists. We believe in evidence and facts. I think the challenge is when people go from the specific to the general. None of us would reject those specific concerns out of hand. But if someone said to us, based on this series of unverified anecdotes, elections in this state or this country are rigged, that's where we would say we have extensive evidence to the contrary, right? And the bar for proving such a claim would be very, very high. A series of anecdotes would not be sufficient to legitimate that claim, right? An analogy you might think about is, consumer protection, right? So if you held a hearing and said, who has complaints about their Toyotas, right? And a bunch of people came and said, my Toyota broke down. And you would say, well, those people have a very legitimate right to make claims on their warranty with Toyota. What that would not prove is that Toyota was systematically manufacturing unreliable cars, or still worse, intentionally manufacturing unreliable cars, right? That would be a much greater leap, right? So that's exactly the circumstance that we're in. Your unreliable Toyota, right, is unfair, and it should be addressed, right? And you should have a system you can be confident in your state that handles those kinds of concerns, whether they're about a vehicle you purchase or a local or election in your jurisdiction. But that is different from saying, therefore, the system is rigged, therefore, there's intentional nefarious behavior taking place behind the scenes. Again, we can never rule out these kinds of concerns, and that's why everyone is, I think, aware of the potential for the folded paper ballot scenario, or even the North Carolina scenario, that we should always be on guard against those. Right? They threaten our democracy if they're allowed to take place. But thankfully, the evidentiary record is remarkably strong. I mean, remember the George W. Bush Department of Justice looked extensively for voter fraud cases. And if you recall, the eventual conclusion was they prosecuted fewer than people who violated protection against migratory birds. Okay, there were shockingly few, I think, relative to people's expectations. Right? Ron DeSantis has an election task force. Most of the people who've been arrested for committing voter fraud were told that they were eligible by the state election administration itself. So again, does that mean any specific claim is wrong? Of course not. We can't know that in advance, right? But we do know something about the rate at which these kinds of anomalies take place, and there's reason, therefore, to be skeptical about the sweeping since 2020.
Thank you. I agree with you that concerns have to be specific. When they get general, they lose their meaning. And I also appreciate the statement that whatever evidence we have as we pass on, we should forward to the AG. I think that's appropriate as well. I have one more. I have multiple questions, but I'll just ask one more if that's okay.
One more.
Okay, thank you. You had made a statement that I agree with regarding when legislation changes, it doesn't necessarily change the level of confidence, because you'll have the people who are for the legislation, their confidence level will go up, and the people who are against it, their confidence level will go down. So New Hampshire has a very lenient voter ID law. It's going to change. It's in court now, but if upheld, it will change on January 1st. But currently, virtually anyone in the world can come to New Hampshire. On election day, they can say, I am whoever I say I am, I live wherever I say I live, and I'm a U.S. citizen, and sign documents, affidavits that swear to it without showing any proof. So voter ID is required in almost every other state, if not every other state in our country. So the law that's going to go into effect on January 1 is one that was contested. How would you suggest that we ensure the integrity of our elections so that voters who actually, people who come and actually cast a vote on election day are actually qualified to do so if this particular new law is held to be unconstitutional. Because that's an important thing, right? Making sure that only people who should be voting are voting.
A couple things, just empirically, it's only been in the last couple of years that most states required some sort of identification to vote, other than first-time voters who registered by mail. So, and so it's not quite right that every state except New Hampshire does that.
Pretty close.
Well, no, I would say, I mean, I don't know the number on top of my head, but roughly, even to this day, somewhere around 20 states. I get the number and get back to you, but somewhere coming up to 20 states, you can vote without. But we can get that number. But I want to respond to the question. If the voter ID is ruled unconstitutional, New Hampshire tried something several years ago. I don't know where this stands, but 20 years ago, when the voting technology project got going, we were very interested in finding some middle ground between folks who believed anyone should just be able to show up and vote, and those who were concerned about the identity of voters. Because there are people, myself included, we have different values, different assumptions about these sorts of things. But both sides, I would argue that both sides of that debate have reasonable, well-intended, good, meaning arguments in favor of voter IDs, against voter IDs. And it seemed to us, one of those areas where you should be able to find a compromise. In most of the world, that compromise is everybody already has an ID, and you show that ID when you go to vote. As a colleague from the Netherlands once said to me, we in Europe have the advantage of once being conquered by Napoleon. So we all have IDs, and every time we move, we have to check in with the authorities. You guys have the disadvantage of not being conquered by Napoleon, because you would have had that. But Americans don't want to have to check in with the authorities. So what do we do? One of the things that we recommended, and I thought New Hampshire was coming close to this at some point, was that that the state provide the photo ID, and given that basically these cameras to produce photo IDs are really cheap, that if you show up to vote without the ID, we'll make you one right then and there. And you may have to show some ID this time, and maybe it's some minimal sort of ID. Maybe you even have to vote a provisional ballot, something like that. But in the future, you will have this ID that the state made for you, and you just bring that. So, I mean, it strikes me that I would hope, there are compromises like that out in the world that could get IDs in everybody's hands. And yet, now, I know my colleagues who, believe religiously against all forms of ID don't like that compromise. But it strikes me that with technology and, kind of a little bit of goodwill, that there are those compromises that would exist. Now, whether they pass muster with the court here in New Hampshire, that's another question. But there are compromises, and I think in another world, certainly 20 years ago, I think there was a greater chance that those sort of compromises get.
Thank you.
Quick comment to follow up here, if you'd like. One nice feature of the United States is the fact that it's composed of many different states. And so, as Professor Stewart was saying, there's a lot of variability in ID laws. Some are strict, some less strict, some don't exist. Some states don't exist. Some states don't have voter ID laws. So that's a really nice thing, sort of scientifically, because if there was a set of procedures that was really sort of deficient and led to lots of ineligible voters voting, we would have some state that probably used it. And so to follow sort of what both of my colleagues have said, there's a tremendous literature on the study of voter integrity, and it hasn't found, to the best of my knowledge, any particular state that looks really bad in a systematic way. And of course, that is what you would have expected to find if, for example, some set of voter ID laws really was problematic. So I would, as a sense of just trying to be reassuring, I don't know anything about the law that you're describing, so I can't comment on that. But one thing I do know is that across the country, there's a lot of variance in laws, and there's not a lot of variance, from what we can see, on the sort of voter fraud that would be associated with ineligible voters voting. So that makes me confident, or pretty confident, that the laws aren't driving that, because we see variability in one variable, but not another.
Just to wrap this up, I don't have a mic, but my colleague here, Andy, just did a quick search. 46 states require photo ID.
We'll go back to you on that one.
According to the National Homelessness Association, registering in a state.
Okay, we're getting a little far afield here, speculation.
We'll get back.
And we have a specific law that's being challenged, of course, that is got provision around things in it. We do have a situation in New Hampshire where people can log in without any identification and sign an affidavit. Those are the things that we're talking about. Two things I would say before we wrap up. First of all, thank you. Three things. Thank you very much for coming. Secondly, you'll be happy to know that the representatives of both political parties, when they were here, agreed at least that we have elections virtually free of fraud in New Hampshire, and are worthy of confidence. And this committee has been listening for a long time, and we've heard a lot of incidents of mistakes. I think we so far haven't heard any incidents of conspiracies, so you'll be happy to hear that. So with that, thank you for coming, and we're going to take a 5-minute break before we get to public comment.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so we're now come to public comment. The co-chair says we have, given the number of people and the amount of time that we have left before a hard stop, 4 minutes each max. We hope to have a hard stop at 4:30. So with that, Samantha Buckley first.
Good afternoon, members. My name is Samantha Buckley with Secure Democracy USA. Secure Democracy USA is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that works to build confidence in our elections and improve voter access across the U.S. Our goal is to support local election officials and state lawmakers to balance election integrity with voter freedom. Since it's 4 minutes, I'm going to focus on our priorities for New Hampshire. That's going to be pre-processing of absentee ballots. It's going to be adding illness as an excuse for absentee voting, establishing post-election audit requirements, expanding access to voter registration for eligible residents, and protecting New Hampshire voter rolls. Specifically for pre-processing of absentee ballots, pre-processing, it is an election administrative procedure that can increase efficiency and help your local election officials to ensure absentee ballots are going to be counted in time. It also holds back against things such as if there are issues with absentee ballots with mailings. Illness. In New Hampshire, currently, disability is an excuse, however, illness is not. And clarifying that and explicitly making it that illness is an excuse in code would probably help voters a lot. For post-election audit requirements. A post-election audit verifies the outcome of an election by ensuring the voting machines counted ballots without error. A post-election audit focuses on the tabulation machines and can find errors in programming or software issues. That may mean clerical issues such of that nature, such that the professors discussed earlier. Developing and implementing a post-election audit program does not have to be cumbersome or expensive. Post-election audits do serve a purpose, and that is evidenced by the fact that there are 34 states that currently have post-election audit programs. Risk limiting audits, or RLAs, have become a gold standard for post-election audits in the U.S. due to their efficiency and have been conducted in the U.S. for over a decade. Generally, RLAs reduce the time and cost of auditing the voting machines. Also for expanding voter registration access to eligible residents. Currently, voter registration is not online or electronic in New Hampshire, but creating online voter registration would make registration more accessible for eligible residents and reduce administrative costs for election officials and make it easier to update and maintain a state's voter rolls. Online voter registration can happen securely. It can be done securely while also supporting your voters. What that means that many states with their OVRs, they actually do it by verifying credentials or information through DMV. So that's going to be a secondary, almost like a secondary layer of verifying information. So it's not necessarily just doing one aspect with your election official, your clerk, but also going through the DMV because you are having to supply certain information. Currently, 40 states allow voters to register to vote online, and that's actually still growing. By 2023, New Hampshire will be one of the only states that does not have OVR. Next is protecting New Hampshire voter rolls. Every state has an obligation to responsibly maintain its voter rolls, both to ensure the list of eligible voters remains accurate and up to date, and to ensure that eligible voters are not erroneously removed and denied their access to the ballot. In an effort to achieve both of these goals, 30 states have joined Eyring, so that's the Electronic Registration Information Center, which is a bipartisan organization dedicated to ensuring the efficiency and integrity of America's voter rolls. Eyring members are able to securely share accurate voter information to help states identify voters who have moved within their state and out of state as well. Voters who have died, duplicate registration in the same state, and individuals who are potentially eligible to vote but who are not yet registered. So these are our priorities with the thank you for listening. Any questions?
One question, and I'm going to set a precedent to elongate this, but doesn't our same-day registration solve some of the issues and kind of ameliorate some of the issues that you put
So same-day registration, wonderful, and that is definitely something that, New Hampshire should be proud of. Some of these things, yes, same-day registration can, but also there are other means or other methods to, I want to say, increase that integrity, increase that security. When you're looking at something like OVR, to ensure that all of the information that the voter provides is matching other databases, would be an example of that. So yes, same day, but also there are other means as well. So almost like creating multiple methods or means.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Alex Teschner, Institute for Responsive Government.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, committee.
You can tilt it up, let's go with that. There you go, perfect.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to the committee today, Secretary Scanlon. My name is Alex Teschner from the Institute for Responsive Government. My background is in election law, election policy. I previously served in the Department of Justice, enforcing civil protections for the right to vote. Our organization, our mission is to help policymakers find practical solutions that make government efficient, accessible, and responsive. And I think at the core, we believe that effective government builds confidence. We have compiled 8 short reports about policy measures that we think will accomplish that, will provide it to the committee in writing. Covers many of it, the same topics we just heard about. We'll hear about upgraded ballot tabulation devices, e-poll books, online voter registration, automatic voter registration, but also investing in local election officials by allocating some unspent HAVA funds towards local election officials. But I wanted to spend the time that I have before the commission today to talk about the significant benefits for election integrity and efficiency from the Electronic Registration Information Center, which you just heard a little bit about. It's a 10-year-old, or ERIC, I'll refer to it as ERIC. It's a 10-year-old nonprofit organization. It's run by the 33 member state organizations. The chief election official of each state is a member of ERIC. Every New England state other than New Hampshire is a member. It's divided almost evenly between Republican and Democratic controlled states. Election officials created ERIC to manage the challenge of keeping the voter registration rolls up to date. And I think very practically, people move, voters unfortunately pass away, and people don't update election officials in their prior jurisdiction when one of those changes occurs. And so what ERIC does is it pools resources and information data from member states and enables those states to use basically state-of-the-art database matching technology to create a series of end products for the chief state election official of the state. And that's basically reports that then the member states can use to accomplish list maintenance tasks in their states as they see fit. There's sort of 5 basic reports that it can create. A report on people who move in the state or out of the state, a report on voters who pass away, and I think critically people who pass away in other states because it's using federal Social Security death data, duplicate registrations, so information about people who may be on the voter rolls in 2 different jurisdictions within New Hampshire. And so for those 3 categories that I just discussed, that information enables election officials to then perform the appropriate list maintenance tasks with respect to those registrations. It also can create lists of potential double voters, people who vote twice in New Hampshire or in two different states on the same day. That allows investigation, appropriate referral to law enforcement. And finally, it can help create a list of eligible voters in the state who are unregistered. And that can be used for outreach where appropriate. ERIC provides these services that are sort of unique public service but at very low cost. John Merrill, who is the Secretary of State of Alabama, recently put it, the state of Alabama can spend tens of billions of taxpayer dollars on a recurring annual basis and still not be able to provide the same level of services that ERIC provides every year. The cost is quite low. The cost also decreases as more states join. And ERIC provides these services with maintaining a focus on data privacy and data security with regular third-party assessments of data and a privacy advisory board. We think that it's high time for New Hampshire to join the coalition of states that have put ERIC together and think that it would be a very concrete step towards increasing the integrity of voter registration rules and also increasing voter confidence along with it. And I'm happy to answer any questions that the committee may have on ERIC.
Okay, Lisa Dundas, Federal Center for Justice.
My name is Lisa Danitz, and I am testifying on behalf of the Brennan Center for Justice. I'm skeptical I can get to 4 minutes, but I'm hoping you'll indulge me since my testimony is directly responsive to Co-Chair Swett's question to the academics here about what New Hampshire does well and where improvements might be needed in the election administration system. As you can see, I have handed out written testimony, which is much greater detail than what I'm going to offer here. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to comment. New Hampshire's current ballot system has significant security features in place to ensure that voters cast ballots are counted accurately. New Hampshire elections are conducted entirely on paper ballots, which are considered the gold standard in election security, as you heard from Professor Stewart, because voters can easily verify that their ballot accurately reflects their choices, and election administrators can easily identify any tampering with the ballot. Only paper ballots that satisfy certain criteria can be run through a tabulator, and paper ballots facilitate the accuracy of recounts, as there is a clear, unedited resource to recount. Additionally, current protocols safeguard the accuracy of New Hampshire's AccuVote tabulators, which count 85% of the state's ballots and prevent hacking. The machines are not connected to the internet, so voters should remain confident that there has been no tampering or hacking during the conduct of the election. Prior to Election Day, election officials do logic and accuracy testing. They test all AccuVote machines by running pre-marked sample ballots through them with every possible memory card, and then checking the computed totals against the expected totals to ensure an accurate tabulation occurs. After testing, the machines are secured until the moderator receives them on Election Day. While most New Hampshire voters vote in person, absentee ballots are a staple of New Hampshire election administration. Of course, were used more broadly in 2020 than in other elections, and this was true nationwide as well. The incidence of voter fraud associated with absentee ballots is very low and has remained just as low even as its usage has increased. Confidence in absentee ballots is warranted based on the multiplicity of features that ensure their safety and security, many of which I detailed in my written testimony. For now, I would like to move to address recommendations for how New Hampshire can improve voter confidence through system improvements. The Brennan Center recommends modernizing the New Hampshire election administration system through the purchase of up-to-date voting machines, adoption of regular post-election tabulation audits, as has been mentioned several times already, and update of the voter registration process, in addition to proactively protecting election workers from interference or threats and limiting the possibility of insider threats. In my oral testimony, I will focus specifically on the need for the purchase of EAC-certified voting machines and adoption of regular post-election tabulation audits. The other recommendations are addressed in my written testimony. In the New Hampshire localities that rely on machine count, the current tabulators, which are over 30 years old and have been discontinued, rely on technology for which the vendor will not guarantee support beyond the 2024 presidential election. Older machines are more likely to break down, and cause long lines at the polls, are increasingly difficult to repair as parts are no longer manufactured, and are less likely to have the kind of security features we expect of voting machines today. For example, AccuVote machines lack modern data encryption, authentication, and user access control technology that is standard in new systems. These machines need to be replaced and upgraded. 2 new machines have already been presented to the Ballot Law Commission. In approving new machines for trial, New Hampshire should consider only those tabulators that are EAC certified. EAC certification requires that the machines must meet the Voluntary Voter System Guidelines, or VVSG, which include, among other requirements I've identified in the written testimony, a minimum error rate of no more than 1 in 125,000 ballots. While some have advocated before you a broad-scale move to hand counting becomes increasingly difficult as jurisdiction size increases because the count takes longer to complete, and when there are many contests on a large number of ballots, the error rate increases. We can see from the 2020 election experience that voter confidence decreases the longer it takes to finalize election results, and recent polling confirms this to be the case. Moreover, hand counting in larger jurisdictions is unlikely to meet the error rate required of tabulators by the VVSG. In fact, a laboratory study of various hand counting methods found that hand counting of ballots introduces significant errors. New Hampshire's localities seem to know this intuitively, with the exception of 3 towns, all with a population lower than 1,000 rely on hand counting. For towns between 1,000 and 3,000, there is a mix of reliance on hand counting and tabulators, and in towns with a population over 3,000, all but 3 rely on tabulators. Given the length of time to finalize election results and the human error associated with hand counting in larger jurisdictions, New Hampshire's localities would be wise to resist the push to broaden reliance on hand counting. Rather, based on these factors, New Hampshire jurisdictions that currently use the AccuVote machines should purchase new machines that are EAC certified and therefore meet the VVSG error rate. We understand that New Hampshire has available over 2/3 of its HAVA security grant funds, and we recommend that the state should rely on those funds to support its town's purchase of new tabulators. Beyond the purchase of new machines, New Hampshire should broadly adopt post-election tabulation audits, which allow election officials to verify that tabulators have counted ballots accurately. You've heard that as of now, New Hampshire is one of only a small number of states that does not require a post-election tabulation audit, although the legislature did pass a law for the audit of a handful of voting districts for the 2022 primary and general election. With a post-election tabulation audit, local election officials audit a percentage of the tabulation equipment and ballots to verify election outcomes prior to certification of an election. Post-election audits are conducted in a transparent manner by impartial election officials, often in bipartisan teams, according to predetermined rules, with a documented process to ensure security of voting equipment, maintain chain of custody of voted ballots, and protect voters' personal information. The gold standard post-election tabulation audit is called a risk-limiting audit, or RLA. In an RLA, based on statistical analysis, election officials hand count a sample of paper ballots to provide strong evidence that the reported election night result was correct. Importantly, RLAs are designed so that the process takes the circumstances of the election outcome into account. For example, if the margin of election is wide, then fewer ballots need to be reviewed. If the margin is narrow, more ballots will be reviewed up to the point that enough evidence is provided of the desired level of confidence in the declared election result. As a risk-limiting audit has the capacity to detect whether any outcome determinative interference has occurred, routine RLAs are highly recommended by security experts as a method of protecting the integrity of elections. To bolster voter confidence, New Hampshire should implement a risk-limiting audit system that takes place automatically after an election is concluded and that remains in place regardless of outcomes in order to verify the security and accuracy of each election. For the remainder of the Brennan Center's recommendations, I refer you primarily to my written testimony, though I would like to highlight one resource for you. That's CISA's Election Infrastructure Insider Threat Mitigation Guide, which I think will provide the committee with excellent information, and the citation is in my written testimony toward the end. Thank you for having me here today.
Nice job.
Thank you. Did I answer your question?
Very, very nicely laid out. I appreciate the written testimony. It's very self-explanatory.
Thanks for giving me.
I have already read it and marked it up.
Never let it be said I was prohibiting my co-chair from speaking. Any questions? John Segedy from Hillsborough.
Thank you. I will attempt to be brief. I am the moderator for the Hillsborough Eyring School District, but to be clear, I am not speaking on behalf of the school district or the administration, but solely myself as moderator.
John Segedy.
Segedy, S-E-G-E-D-Y. Just as way of background, over the past decade and a half, I have participated in 3 recounts, one as a school board member, one as a candidate for an office, and one as a moderator. This I see is important in that I have seen the accuracy of the ballot counts that have taken place. There have in all of those only been a couple of changes, and Those changes, for the most part, if I can recall correctly, were mainly in interpretations of double markings, where people may have put an X on one spot and filled in a circle on another one, and they were only supposed to do one, and it's up to the interpretation. It's certainly not an issue of concern or fraud in the big picture. In all of those, there were no results changed in terms of the outcomes. In all of that time, I have never seen in our district any fraud or cases brought forward, improper people voting or any of that. In general, I have not seen a lot of, over the years, any lack of confidence until in recent years with repeated attempts by politicians to address supposed problems that didn't actually exist in any great number. It is these changes that have actually made it harder, in my opinion, for citizens to have confidence in voting. A vote that has not taken place because of rules that have made it harder for people to vote is as much of a concern, if not more of a concern, than a possible extra vote taken by a theoretical fraud case. A lot of these changes in voting rules and regulations started with an attempt to disenfranchise, in my opinion, the votes of students in college towns, and at the same time not and by making, most of the rules have been making it harder for people to vote. As Americans, we ought to be making it easy and encouraging people to vote. I have seen the numbers of votes cast, numbers of people coming out to vote decrease to the point where towns generally are lucky to get anyway close to half of their voters to show up. That is more of a problem than one or two possible misvotes. That's what I came to say. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to listen.
Could you please state which law or rules made it more difficult for students to vote, please?
I don't have the laws in front of me, but I know that restrictions were put in place to make them have to produce different IDs from, have to go get a bill from their residence hall, things like that. Snowbirds who may have a place in Florida and a place here and know the people at the town hall. Nobody would even think to question that. None of the clerks or anything.
John, thank you for your testimony. Thank you for your service to your community. A quick question. Have you received any training on how to conduct elections as a moderator?
Yes, since I became a moderator, and I've only been a moderator the last 2 elections, 3 years. But I've been involved in towns, in the town, in other aspects. Yes, the local government center does put on a training every year. And we also learn through a listserv where people ask questions and get answers back. Many of the people on there are attorneys. more training, probably. It's a problem with the fact that it's all volunteer positions for the most part. Actually, I get a small stipend, but it probably doesn't cover the gas.
Thank you.
Are you aware that the Secretary of State's office offers training?
I have not taken any trainings there, but
Thank you for your testimony.
My name is John Farrell. I live here in Keene. I happen to be the elected clerk at Ward 5 here in Keene, so I'm responsible to count the votes for a little over 3,000 voters. I'm not speaking on behalf of the city of Keene or in my capacity as a clerk. I'm speaking by myself. Number one, I'd like to say I want to thank the legislature and the Secretary of State's office for starting to do audits of elections. They're going to audit 2 in the primary and 4 in the general. I think that program should be expanded. Not, everybody, but to a significant extent, and the results of those audits be published, because that'll help improve confidence in the voting system. Number 2, we currently use the ActiVote system now here in Keene. I'm very comfortable with its capabilities and its limitations. As a clerk, I think it does a reasonably good job of counting the ballots that don't have faults. I want to tell you that the legislature telling us that we have to hand count all ballots with overvotes was a great move. I think that'll help a lot. That addresses specifically the Windham issue, but I think it will make a big difference for everybody. Third thing I want to say is, in 2 years, our ActiVote system will become unmaintainable. And when it's replaced, if a scanner system can't be identified that is absolutely bulletproof, I would, despite the fact that it's going to cost the clerks more work, I'd recommend we go back to hand vote and keep the districts small. I mean, it's one thing to hand vote, 2,000 ballots, another thing to hand vote 20,000 ballots. So keep them small, keep them local. That's the best for New Hampshire. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony.
Good afternoon, committee members. My name is Tina Barton. I'm a former election administrator who recently concluded a 32-year career in public service, during which I served at the municipal, county, and federal levels. The last 17 years of my career have been focused on election administration. I administered numerous elections over the span of my career. Over the last few years, words like have been used as mis, dis, and malinformation to manipulate and polarize our country. These words like fraud, stolen, and manipulation have empowered people to verbally attack election officials, threaten their lives, threaten their families, and intimidate their staff. Dehumanizing others is the process by which we become accepting of violations against human nature and the human spirit. A dehumanization of election workers and election administrators is taking place in this country. On November 10, 2020, exactly 1 week after the election, I received my first death threat. I would play it for you today, but the language is incredibly offensive. In that 1 minute, 30-second message, the caller uses the F word incessantly, calls me the B word throughout the message, and calls me a sexual term over and over. He goes on to say that I am a rhino that should be executed. He says that I should have a knife to my throat, and warns that the police agency won't have time to protect me because there are too many of them, and when I least expect it, patriots will surround me and kill me. While this threat is unique to me, these types of threats are not unique to election officials. The U.S. Department of Justice has logged more than 1,000 threats to election administrators and election workers in the last 2 years. Election administrators and workers have been made out to be the enemy. the human spirit and physical security of election administrators and election workers have been under relentless attack, and this has resulted in an exodus of years of institutional knowledge and decades of experience in election administration. This is the real great resignation in our country. Current events show that there is a need for cross-partisan collaboration. It is the reason why we are seeing the unprecedented formation of the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections. We are a committee that consists of current and former law enforcement and current and former election officials. Our shared purpose is to protect election officials, workers, voters in our elections. We have three overarching goals: to build trust and stronger relationships between election officials and law enforcement, to develop solutions that respond and help curb the rise in intimidation, threats, and violence against election workers, and to create shared resources and best practices for law enforcement and election officials. I have a few recommendations. I know that's what you're seeking today. Election officials need funding and resources to combat mis, dis, and malinformation. Election officials consistently list help with communications as one of their top needs. Election officials need support from elected officials and people who have influence with their constituencies. They need you to amplify them as trusted sources of information and to share truth on their behalf. I ask you to consider ways that you can protect election officials, like shielding their personally identifiable information, PII, and making it unlawful to threaten or intimidate them. Lastly, I ask you to humanize us. Remind people that we are their neighbors. We attend church with them. Our kids go to school together. We shop at the same grocery stores and eat at the same restaurants. We cheer for the same college teams. We are sons, daughters, spouses, parents, and grandparents. If our elections are genuinely critical infrastructure as designated by the Department of Homeland Security in 2017, we must protect them by ensuring safety for those who administer them. Thank you for your time and your attention.
Matt?
Mooshian. Good afternoon, members of the committee. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Matt Mooshian. I live in Claremont, where I serve as a city councilor, and I also work with 603 Forward, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to educating, activating, and empowering young working-age people in our state. Again, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. Over the past few elections, I've had a unique opportunity to participate in our democracy, both by working at the polls as a volunteer poll worker and also appearing on the ballot myself. My experiences have really shown me how dedicated our election officials are to running free, fair, and honest elections. When I first volunteered at the polls back in 2016, the folks who I worked with were very professional, well-informed, and courteous. And when I ran for city council and was elected, the voters of Claremont and myself trusted that our election officials would do their job to report the results accurately. And even when the race was very close and we had to have a recount, the hand recount didn't change the results, and the candidates and voters alike were confident in our process. But support for our elections doesn't end with just me. In polling released just this morning, nearly 80% of Granite Staters polled said that New Hampshire elections are secure and free of fraud. And 83% said that they were confident local election officials would securely and fairly run our 2022 elections. So this committee has been meeting over the course of the summer, and I know that you've had the opportunity to hear from folks all across the state of different backgrounds and ideologies. And I do know that at times there have been misinformation or conspiracy theories that were shared with little pushback But as we wrap up these meetings and move towards releasing your report, I do hope that you'll remember that New Hampshire voters are confident in our elections. And you remember that voter confidence is about reinforcing and uplifting the security of our elections while also making sure that every voter has access to the ballot box. To put it plain and simply, our elections are stronger when we all have a say in our democracy. Also, during these meetings, I know that you have heard many common sense solutions that would deepen the connection between voters in our elections and ensure that all Granite Staters have their voice heard. And I'd like to use the remainder of my time to just draw attention to a few of them that I believe would make a positive impact on our election system. Some of these improvements are straightforward and pretty simple, like the Secretary of State's office providing towns with a template for their websites so that voting information is up to date, easy to navigate, and accurate. And there are also modernization solutions, many of which a majority of other states have already adopted, that would improve voters' access, transparency, and trust in our elections. These could be establishing online voter registration portal so that voters can register online and ensure their voter information is up to date before election day, or implementing an automatic voter registration system at state agencies so that way when Granite Staters are going to get their license renewed or getting it for the first time, they can enroll to vote at that time. And then lastly, I think if this committee is really interested in continuing to build our voter confidence, that New Hampshire should enroll in the Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC, which I know someone talked about earlier. And as they shared, it's a database that is sophisticated enough to compare voter rolls with other states automatically and remove people who have been registered in other states or moved within the state. It would flag deceased voters to be removed from the checklist, and it would automatically catch possible cases of voter fraud immediately after an election. When Granite Staters were asked about ERIC and the polling I mentioned earlier, 82% of those polled supported New Hampshire becoming a member. Finally, the special committee was established to seek solutions that would strengthen trust in our election process and build upon the unique pride that Granite Staters have in our elections. During my brief time with you this afternoon, I talked about some straightforward, simple modernization solutions that this committee could put forward in their report to make voting a more accessible, transparent, and modern process. As you reflect on these meetings and look to the work of building your report, I hope you will cut through some of the misinformation and conspiracy theories you've heard, remember the mission that you were given, and deliver results that Granite Staters would be proud of and that would actually increase our voter confidence. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Come back, Matt. You got a question?
Two things, actually, quick. First of all, I just didn't catch all of it. You mentioned the Secretary of State providing templates.
Yeah, for town websites, so that election information is easily accessible for all folks in your town. I know in my town of Claremont, it can be, for lack of a better word, a little wonky to get to where you need to be. So we had a template, it could be very easy for folks to find the information they're looking for.
Thank you.
Mackenzie St. Germain.
My name is Mackenzie St. Germain. I'm the New Hampshire Campaign for Voting Rights Director, which is a nonpartisan coalition focused on ensuring a healthy democracy through accessible and well-governed elections. Thank you for allowing me the chance to present one last time to the committee before you make your final recommendations for improving voter confidence in New Hampshire. Following up on my presentation to the committee in Nashua last month on the policies in the coalition's platform to increase voter confidence by modernizing and improving our elections, we were able to work with a polling firm to complete a poll of New Hampshire voters to assess the views on voter confidence in New Hampshire, as well as support for some of our proposed policies that you've heard about during the last 4 months of meetings. We have some very interesting polling top lines to share, and you all have copies of the data directly as well. The survey found in general, likely New Hampshire voters expressed a high level of confidence in our elections, with 78% of those surveyed saying they were somewhat or very confident that New Hampshire elections are secure and free of widespread voter fraud. In addition, 83% of those surveys say they were somewhat or very confident that their local town election administrators will fairly administer this fall's election.
I'm not finding those numbers.
That's question one, right?
Right?
So question 2, you have to add the very
Yeah, so it's very confident and somewhat confident are the two numbers here.
You have to add
Oh,
it
you're
together.
adding the two.
Yes, so it's those who are very or somewhat confident. And then 81,
Yeah, well,
so question, if you go to the next, I'm not running through every single question.
right, just
but-
refer to the question you're talking about, otherwise
Okay.
I'm not following the numbers.
So 81% of those surveyed said they believe that counting paper ballots through scanner machines, as it's done in New Hampshire elections, is a very or somewhat accurate way of counting ballots. I believe that is question 8. Although these numbers are very encouraging and they reinforce the findings of the similar UNH study that was conducted earlier this year, clearly there is some room for improvement in modernizing our elections here in New Hampshire. When voters were asked about automatic voter registration, I believe that's question 11, which would create an opt-out voter registration system for anyone who provides the DMV with identification that establishes citizenship and voter eligibility. 65% of people said they supported the proposal, with only 25% opposed, which is a majority of Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. There's also been a lot of conversation, including today, about New Hampshire joining the Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC. When surveyed, 82% of voters supported New Hampshire joining ERIC, with only 9% opposed. This included 76% of Republicans, 81% of Independents, and 90% of Democrats. That is question 12. New Hampshire adopting a post-election audit process, which is question 13, showed similarly strong bipartisan support, with 82% of voters surveyed in favor, including 87% of Republicans, 85% of Independents, and 70% of Democrats. These days, it's difficult to find a wide bipartisan consensus on anything. However, this survey data shows that these are common sense policies which are effectively implemented in states under both Republican and Democratic leadership, and they are not partisan. They're effective policies that would help improve election access, security, modernization, and have widespread support from Granite Staters. As I said, I have copies of the polling top lines. I'm also happy to email a PDF over so you have it in the record. And I'm happy to answer questions now or connect you with those who completed the survey if there are any further questions you'd like to ask them. And I urge you, along with all members of the New Hampshire Campaign for Voting Rights, as you consider your recommendations in the next month or so, to not allow the loud voices of a few extreme beliefs that are not tethered to facts to have a disproportionate sway rather than the majority of New Hampshire voters, and believe that we can modernize our elections and truly build voter confidence through some of these policies.
Thank you.
Any questions? One.
Yes.
I've heard people say we should ignore some of the testimony from before. And I'm confused as to what it is you're asking us to ignore. What extreme testimony has been proposed that we should not listen to?
There have been, in the course of the meetings, and I think you've all seen me at most of them, and I've been up here a few times, folks who are claiming fraud, claiming voter fraud, claiming folks are illegally voting in the elections, and those have not been, those cases, the affidavits, they have not been gone through a process, gone to the AG, been investigated. It's very easy for us, for example, in some of those cases, saying there's no, I know the affidavits were shared with the committee, saying something like, oh, this house doesn't exist, this person didn't actually, is voting illegally. That's a place where perhaps they had written the address wrong on the form because all of our forms are written by hand. I know I've been here through a lot of meetings where, including my name, it's a little bit hard to read on the sheets. Our handwriting is not great. As was spoken about earlier from the academic experts, a lot of these things are clerical errors. So I just want to, in recommendations and talking about voter confidence, the majority of what the majority of New Hampshire voters want and need. I think the people who have the time to go to these meetings and sit here for a bunch of hours, including myself, are not necessarily representative of the entire state. And those pieces of data that you've seen in terms of things that are brought forward to the committee, I think they just need to have thorough investigation as opposed to just taking them, at the word without doing that investigation.
I would like to just assure you that at our last meeting in Berlin, we did have the AG's office there. We talked extensively about both people with your point of view and people who have the concerns about the affidavits. And the AG's office was very willing to work with them and to try and work through that whole process. So I think we're in a good place of discovery.
My name is Connie Lane, and I'm a state representative from Merrimack District 12 for the past 4 years. I'm also on the election law committee in the House for 4 years. I was also on the House redistricting committee, and I was also one of the co-authors of SB 43, which was the bill that addressed the audit process in Windham. And before I became a state rep, I was a poll observer for about 20 years all over the state, including Keene. They usually sent me to college towns. So I support what the committee is trying to do to identify the causes of voter confidence decline and make recommendations to reverse that trend. I think that there are 5 major reasons. The way I looked at them were imperfections in the implementation of voting registration process and the procedures on election day, the erroneous perceptions of voter fraud, laws that focus on making it more difficult to vote in the name of voter security, gerrymandering districts to make it easier to achieve Republican majorities, and refusal to close loopholes in our campaign finance laws and address the effect of so-called dark money. I think most of your testimony, at least the ones that I've watched and read the minutes of, have focused on the first 3. So people far more expert in those areas have testified, so I won't attempt to do that. But I would like to endorse updating, educating, and enforcing the election procedures. Automatic or online registration, same-day voter registration, early voting, more voter education, e-poll books, updated voting machines, and implementing post-election audits. Some of these measures, I think, might be able to be implemented by the Secretary of State without legislation. He has regulatory power, and it could be that he might be able to do some of these without having to implement litigation. Don't ask me which ones. And I wrote this paragraph before I heard the professor speak today. It is imperative that we rebut the big lie that due to corruption in our voting system, President Biden was not elected president in 2020. We need to refute continuously and vehemently, in no uncertain terms, these numerous lies and conspiracy theories. We have a long history of robust voter participation in New Hampshire. Our governor, our Secretary of State, and the New Hampshire courts have all stated that there's no rampant fraud in New Hampshire elections. This needs to be said often. No system's perfect, but the one that we have is not corrupt and it can be trusted. So I want to talk quickly to the 2 other reasons that I think there's been a decline in voter confidence, and that's gerrymandering and weak campaign finance laws. I personally witnessed on the House Redistricting Committee last year, the current process of redistricting is not what I think was envisioned by the authors of the U.S. and New Hampshire constitutions. Done correctly, redistricting ensures that districts have equal population and that legislative bodies are, in the words of John Adams, a miniature of the people as a whole. Fortunately, it has been used in New Hampshire for at least 30 years that I've lived here to further political goals by drawing boundaries to protect incumbents and reduce competition, rather than to ensure equal voting power and fair representation. In late 2021, about a year ago, the House Redistricting Committee had 10 public hearings, one in each county, and we did go to Berlin, for voter input into the redistricting process. People begged us to create fair maps that did not favor one party or another. They actually gave us sample maps that would do that. 74 towns in New Hampshire passed warrants demanding fair maps. That number represents 561,000 voters. These pleas fell on the deaf ears of my Republican colleagues. The head of the Republican Party at the outset of the process announced that the congressional districts would be drawn to guarantee that a New Hampshire Republican would be elected to Congress in 2022. The chair of the Senate Districting Committee admitted in testimony to favoring incumbents when drawing their maps. One member of the House Redistricting Committee stated that redistricting was a political process and that he owed it to his party to draw maps favoring Republicans at the expense of his Democratic constituents and Republicans in other districts. We are a purple state, but Republicans created districts that strongly favor obtaining a Republican majority for Executive Council, State House of Representatives, and the State Senate. I personally lost my faith in the redistricting system this past year. What I witnessed was an abomination. It is no wonder that those, so if I've lost my faith in it and I'm running for election, it's no wonder that those people who testified before us and those who passed town warrants have also lost their confidence. My recommendation is that New Hampshire adopt an independent commission to draw maps to submit to the legislature and or the courts. This can be done in a way that is constitutional. The House passed a bill in the 2018 session that created an independent commission, but the governor vetoed it. Or we could amend the New Hampshire Constitution to allow for an independent commission. And I would be happy to draft, sponsor, or co-sponsor and work with anybody to try and get such a bill in place. Turning next to campaign finance laws in New Hampshire.
Time's almost up here.
Okay, I submitted my testimony. I've got, listed in there are things that need to be addressed to do campaign finance laws. And I also would echo some of the other speakers. I do ask that you recommend that we fund the Secretary of State's office and the local towns and recommend that the money be given to them so they can protect the right to vote and implement the procedures that we want them to follow. Because it is a lot of volunteers and it's a lot of work. And I would just ask that we give them enough funds to do what we need to do to protect the right to vote. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, wait, yes, question.
I just want to say thank you for co-sponsoring SB 43. And I'd like to follow up with you on your thoughts about how to form a truly independent redistricting commission, because I agree with you on that as well.
Follow up here or?
No, I'll reach out.
I was to say that, he's not going to let me do that.
I'll reach out to you in the next couple of weeks.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon and welcome to Keene.
Thank you.
Actually abbreviated my testimony, seeing they are coming up to the bewitching hour here. Again, I'm Tricia Little. I'm the city clerk in Keene. I've been the clerk for 41 years. I, along with the staff of about 60 election officials, run the city's voting operation in 5 separate wards. As been mentioned at your past meetings, New Hampshire's elections are run by citizen volunteers. This is both an asset and a risk. An asset because there's strong independence at the local level. And although local moderators respect and adhere to the directives of the state, they are not influenced by politics or political movements. They simply do their jobs to the best of their abilities. These hundreds of citizen volunteers are also a risk in that election laws are becoming more complex. And just the mere fact that election officials need to call upon their election knowledge perhaps 2 or 3 times over a 12-month period puts them at a disadvantage. Election laws change every time the legislature is in session. Some are incremental changes, others are sweeping changes driven by the party in power. It is critical in this ever-changing environment that the leadership core of elected officials be supported and retained. Keene is fortunate that many of our election team have been with us for many, many years. But election officials do eventually retire, and we are always thinking about succession planning. This fall, many legislative changes will require more work, but everyone who is involved in the election process wholeheartedly supports the underlying objectives of greater transparency, documented chain of custody, and accurate hand counting of these overvoted ballots. In past meetings, I have read comments about election officials need to be held accountable. I agree that the role that election officials has in terms of administering an election process is a serious one. But there's one final piece of the legislation that I want you to be aware of that is not supportive to retaining or helpful in attracting what I consider the leadership of the election staff. That bill would provide for the loss of voting rights of an election official convicted of misconduct with respect to an election function. I'm not certain what legally misconduct is, but on its face, the loss of an elected official's personal voting rights is very worrisome, and it seems unnecessarily harsh. Here in Keene, we'll be spending time between now and next Tuesday clarifying what misconduct is and trying to reassure our officials of what I hope is an extremely serious and intentional neglect of duty. Instead of taking away an official's right to personal right to vote, I would recommend that having the Attorney General's office ask for a resignation of any elected official would be an more appropriate accountability measure. In terms of what could potentially improve voter trust, I reiterate what you've heard before. The Ballot Law Commission needs to make a recommendation on the next generation of vote tabulators that will be permitted in this state. Hand counting in communities with large populations is not realistic. The vendor who supports our current tabulators say they will only provide support for these devices through the 2024 elections. The identification of the next generation of tabulators is a timely and critical decision that needs to be made. Thank you for listening to my comments.
We're on the machine thing.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you for all your hard work. I've been a resident of Keene for 42 years, and I love this state. My question was for your guest, how much did they include in their data the primary in New Hampshire? And in addition, I want to ask the committee about the superdelegate vote in the 2016 primary, and suggest that that was the beginning of losing confidence, voter confidence in this state. And the other question that I have is that although it may be perceived as a partisan issue, don't both parties have to agree on the format of the primary?
You mean the presidential question?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions?
I have one quickest one here. I represent myself. Just a couple of thoughts and opinions of things that would speak to me and to people like me. That, we love all the data. You're going to do a great job of putting together a report that'll have tons of data from academics, and you got to deal with the process and all those hard things that never, you assume it happens, and you trust that it happens. But things that would speak to people like me would be if you emphasize a couple of things. First, the voter registration process. That's the front end. That's how people get into this. Emphasize how that works and the securities that are around that. That's a pretty sharp front end, and a lot of things go on after that, but that's neither here nor there. And the mentions of Eric and maintaining the rolls for the voter rolls, the best job that could be done on maintaining voter rolls would lend a lot of credibility to the integrity of the elections. Then finally, when you've done your report and you're publishing the results and everything, and it's out there, you're going to put it out in the media, newspapers, state websites. Raise the bar on that. Market the hell out of it. Get it out there. Get it on billboards. Let's get Tom Brady in here to tell people how good the elections are in New Hampshire. That's what's going to speak to people.
Did you have any connections?
Yeah. I'll work on it.
I think he's busy that time of year.
I might have better chance with Eli Manning, but that won't work here. That'll speak to people. Marketing, slick marketing, make the message work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jeff Bradford, are you related to Leo?
Yes, sir. It's my dad.
He was the one who submitted.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much, Chair. Okay, former city councilor of Keene. So I've witnessed the work of Patty Little. She's an excellent city clerk from both the perspective of the jobs and tasks she has for council, as well as working the voter process here in Keene. However, there is one area that I think hasn't been discussed much, and that is the out-of-state college students and what the perspectives are from our citizenry in regard to how the out-of-state students are supposed to, what their requirements are for voting. So what I would recommend to the group, to the committee, is that there's in Keene, there's a freshman orientation packet given out every year to the freshmen coming on board. And so what I think, in my opinion, there should be some resources put towards appropriate literature that advises them as to what their rights are as far as voting in the state of New Hampshire while they're in school here. And so that's just my thing. And then also too, I am in favor of the voting machines with paper ballots over just hand voting. I also like local control over voter administration at the federal and state level for voting. I was concerned when somebody I respected highly, still do, Secretary of State Bill Gardner, and thank you for your service also, Secretary of State, and to your staff, and also to the committee as legislators. But I called him with concerns. He was, as you may remember, the chair or co-chair of a national committee on election rights, and I think part of the movement was to potentially nationalize the voting process. At least that's what I expressed to him when he called me on July 4th. And he apologized for the delay in calling back. It was 2 weeks, but he said he's been so busy with his committee work that he was having to phone constituents on July 4th. Just so you know what may lie ahead for you. So at any point, I expressed my concerns on that, and he had no rebuttal to that. He didn't say, don't worry about it, it isn't going to happen. He just heard me out. And then a short while after, just before he left, he did call me again and just wanted to chat about the committee's dissolution, and which I found was interesting. But anyway, it was enjoyable talking to the secretary. The other part was that I'm the most optimistic person in this room. I'm the only one wearing shorts. It's after Labor Day, and my family's from Berlin. So I hope that explains why I'm so informally dressed, but I tend to hang in there after Labor Day as much as I can. Thank you again for your service, and good luck with your report. I thought your representatives, the three you had up here, did an excellent job for you, and hopefully you'll get some use out of their work.
Thank you for your testimony. Any questions?
Your name is it?
Chuck Redfern.
Chuck Redfern, I'm sorry. Redfern.
His father was a distinguished political science professor and president of Keene State College. And a wonderful man.
Thanks.
And a roommate of one of my former partners, Dick Horst, from the university.
I didn't know that.
Joseph Marzoff.
Thank you for coming. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you for coming to Keene, giving me this opportunity to speak. And I think your job is an impossible one. It's very, very, very difficult. Election, voter confidence. I'm more comfortable with election integrity. Voter confidence, if there's something wrong with the elections, it seems like you're putting an effort into convince people rather than making the election sound, which would be, so I would rather see an election integrity committee, but I'm going to talk about both. I'm also, one of the people mentioned the primary. I wonder, I paid very close attention to the 2016 election, the primary election between Hillary and Bernie. And I wonder if you're familiar with, because it's a very instructive report. There was a report that came out around the convention, but it was the matters were being discussed as early as May. It was Democracy Lost, report on the fatally flawed 2016 Democratic primaries. Now, I've been in Keene 9 years. I'm a retired numbers guy, and this report dealt with comparison of the exit polls and the eventual results. And in either 10 to 12 states, 12 states were unsure, but in 10 to 12 states, Hillary's results were more standard deviations away from the exit polls than were reasonable. So it looked like, and the same thing didn't happen, whereas Trump swamped the Republicans, the same things didn't happen on that side. The amazing thing about this report, and you just have to read the executive summary, which is about 10 pages, is that it connects these results to facts on the ground. You know, funky machines, dirty tricks, things that were going on that would make these unusual effects. Anyway, I'm going to go to I'm happy to hear that, but it was the exit polls that really turned this up, you know, let you see that what was going on, and they seem to, exit polls seem to have disappeared. I'm happy to hear that we now are going to have election audits, and that's one thing where you know, the exit polls can help you because they can indicate what machines or districts look suspicious, and you could target your audits in those places, at least partially. But I guess some should be random, but and some should be like just like figured out on the spot, you know, what seems to be looking unusual, but this, and some should be indicated by various statistics, which, like maybe the amount of complaints you got, or the differences between prior results for those districts. So one thing I would do is, I would bring back exit polls and look for them as an input to check the results. Another thing is we're really talking about recourse. We're really, public is losing recourse. I'm very concerned about, let's say, like the vaccine injured, let's say. But there's various ways that the public has lost its ability to fight back. The loss of freedoms when you couldn't protest for a while, you couldn't go in groups, things like that. But one thing I would suggest, there seems to be a amount of control that the two-party system has, and New Hampshire makes it very difficult, ballot access very difficult. And what I would like to see, I would like to see 4 parties on the ballot at least. And that's very easy to do. It could be the 4 parties that did best in the national presidential election, and they could stay on the ballot for 4 years. That's a very easy fix. Or you could, right now there's a 4% hurdle that you could change to 1%, which would give other parties a better chance. But people need a real.
We're 5.5 minutes, sir.
Okay, a real progressive party. I'm almost done. Real progressive party and a real conservative party. All right, thank you for what you do.
Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Any questions?
Good afternoon. It's almost good evening. I'll try to be quick. My name is Christy St. Laurent. I have been a poll worker in local elections. I'm currently a candidate, and I was the candidate that requested the audit leading, or the recount leading to the Windham audit. I want to start with just a couple of points by way of example and finish more broadly. In 2020, the trend in New Hampshire, it seemed, was for President Biden to win the absentee voting, while former President Trump would be frequently winning the in-person voting. And this was also seen around the country. For example, the statistics out there for all the states, I just happened to latch onto this one. In Alaska, in 2016, former President Trump had very comparable results between absentee and in-person, 15 points and 17 points. In 2020, in Alaska, President Biden won the absentee votes by 19 points, and former President Trump won the in-person voting by 36 points. So people may not like the results or the outcomes or the differences, but that magnitude would be apparent to our local election officials if it was fraudulent. But it wasn't. There was numerous investigations and court cases around the country, and no fraud was ever found. So at the last meeting up in Berlin, one of the members of the committee, Mr. Eyring, had pointed out that the absentee ballots in Windham, there was talk from the audit results that one of the machines showed more votes for President Biden than would have been anticipated by the overall results. And he said that there were a lot of Democrats that cast absentee ballots, but not enough to explain that outcome. Well, I would say that the critical part of voting in America is that our voting is private. And so judging or raising concern based on the party registration of the people who vote is assuming that you know how those people vote. So you don't know what people do in the privacy of the voting booth. So those absentee ballots included votes for President Biden, more than anticipated, but those votes were from people who were Democrats, Republicans, and undeclared. In terms of the report from the Attorney General and the Secretary of State review of the Windham election, there's been many assertions about the egregious errors, and I say that only because the verbiage from the letter that was very harshly worded has been used again and again, and people in Windham are afraid that that means that the results were wrong, but that's not true. If you look at the Windham audit results, it showed we had 10,006 ballots that went out and 10,003 were accounted for. 3 went missing. But that's a statistically very, very small number. And the results for the races that were not on a fold were exceptionally consistent between election day and then when all 4 machines were compared. The folding error did not affect every absentee ballot. That's another thing that people think. If they voted absentee, they think their ballot didn't count, that their vote didn't count. We have 3,000 absentee ballots in Windham, and only about 400 were affected. But again, because of the discrepancy, people feel that absentee ballots across the state didn't count, and that's just not true. Our technology that we use in New Hampshire is dated, but it's simple and concise, and the tampering would be evident either physically through the tapes over the slots. You guys know how all that works, as well as in examining the code. It would be pretty apparent because it's a little bit archaic, but it makes it very clear when there's been tampering. And then the audit also demonstrated the inability of our ballot counting devices to connect to the internet. They've effectively been neutered and covered over again with the tamper-evident tape, and they predate Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, so they cannot connect to the internet. And yet we heard people from the public talk about concern that our machines can connect to the internet, and they just can't. If they could just know that knowledge, I think that they would feel more confident. Sorry, it's been a long day. And also there's been a long history of recounts, investigations by the Attorney General and the Windham audit, and none of those found evidence of systemic fraud. So I think, and we talked about this a little bit at the meeting last time in Berlin, that we need to get that information out to people. It needs to be loud and clear. For example, with the Windham report, that there's a lot of concern over the different cardboard boxes that were used and 5 instead of 7 signatures on some of them, and not the right number of ballots being tested ahead of time. But none of those lapses changed the outcome. So again, it's how the information is communicated to people. So yes, we have a special person watching over our election this time. Great, let's make sure we don't have those lapses again. But the fact that there were those lapses did not change the results.
Okay, slide.
All right, so my 4 things that I would recommend to improve voter confidence, again, would be the clear communication of the strengths of the New Hampshire elections, no internet access, very tamper-evident, publish the number of cases, we talked about that time, and how many people have been convicted. And also, I'm very happy to see that our overvoted ballots will now be hand counted. We need to echo these facts by trusted voices. I think someone else said Tom Brady, anybody. But we talked about both party heads have said that they feel confident in our elections in New Hampshire. We need to get that out there. Our governor, our legislators, and other celebrity voices that would have impact with different people. Secretary Scanlon, you could see about hosting a competition for high school, college kids, upstart small businesses to be able to craft those messages, have a competition, and then put those winners out there. And I think by people delving into the information to create those, then they're going to learn more and have more confidence, and that's going to spread. And those can be on social media, public service, radio and TV ads, at billboards. We've talked about the post-election audits. I think that I'm glad to see we have a few happening. We could use a few more, but it's a good start. I'd like to see that trend continue. And then also, as we look to new machines, I'd really like to see the retention of paper ballots and using ballot counting devices versus some sort of voting machine. And then when we have those ballots set up, make sure that they're clearly set up with areas for the fold with no text or voting ovals to be folded. Thank you.
Thank you.
I really don't want to get into a Windham debate here.
I just want to point out that it's important for this committee to not downplay the report of the AG and the Secretary of State's office. There were over 130 violations of election laws and procedures. The results didn't change of the election, but they came close to changing. 1,163 votes were changed in the hand recount from election day. The machines didn't work properly. So, it's important that this committee take all of that into consideration when we put our report together.
Just brief rebuttal. The machines were shown to work properly. They're supposed to register the derangement of light. The derangement of light was caused by the fold. There was nothing in the training manuals that said anything about placement of fold, concern of fold, or using machines.
The Secretary of State issues documentation that talks specifically about the folds through the ballots. That's against the law to do that. And
can you show that to me in the voter manual in place for the 2020 election? I would like to see that.
I don't want this to be a Windham debate. This committee is about a lot more than the Windham election.
Yes.
So, actually, that concludes the public testimony. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We have two more items on our agenda. The next one is discussion of meeting format for the committee report. I'm happy to volunteer one of our conference rooms at our office, which is kind of simple.
Okay.
And obviously, it's a public meeting, so we have to notice of public access under the right now. We've done that before.
Okay.
So the 20th in the morning?
December 20th.
10 to 1.
10 to 1, 1,000 Elm Street, 17th floor. The final item on our agenda is adjournment. If someone wants to make a motion to...
Make a motion to adjourn.
Motion made. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
It's a vote. Thank you.
Get that morning.